keep in mind while listening that I'm choosing to remain open-minded because I simply can't think of any explanation for the events that happened. From 2012 to 2013, I did quite a lot of hiking in and around the coastal range in Oregon. I frequently would go out by myself for days at a time and only come into town to restock on food if necessary. It was commonplace for when I was in town to spend the entire day hiking back the 4 hours to where I was camping at dusk. The trail I took was not well traveled and looked more like a deer path than anything. I had actually chosen my campsite specifically for its lack of foot traffic and its serenity, avoiding conventional locations altogether. I only had a cell phone on me during this period of hiking and camping. No bright clothing, no GPS tracking device, or emergency beacon either. Looking back, that probably was not the smartest idea. There were times when I heard and saw things while out in the forest that I didn't recognize by sight or sound, but nothing came close to this incident I had in May 2013. I had just done my usual restock in a small town some 6 miles from where I had decided to camp for the night, and I spent the whole day in town and walking back as usual. By the time I had started to walk back to my camp location though, it was about dusk. Half of the walk I chose to use dirt roads, until veering off onto the deer trail I used earlier in the day. By this time it was now completely dark out, but it was still clear enough that it was possible to see the trail using only the moonlight. I don't tend to listen to headphones or things like that while hiking. I've always thought it wise instead to be able to hear what's around me in the event there was a predator, whether human or animal or whatever. At that moment, I was mentally doing some calculations for the next day's hike, when my mind just stopped mid-track. I hadn't heard anything specifically, and I don't make hardly any sounds when hiking. If I had heard something, I'm sure I would have known. But for some reason, be it a sixth sense or survival instinct, I'm not sure, I was suddenly jolted out of mid-thought. I was now very aware I was not alone on this trail. What was odd to me especially is that even though I had heard nothing whatsoever, light wind and no birds around, I knew acutely that something was right behind me, specifically about 30 yards down the trail hidden away in some bushes. I still to this day have so many unanswered questions about how I could just feel this presence there. Standing really still, I turned around to look down the trail. I didn't see anything, but I could still feel that presence right there. It's honestly really difficult to pin down exactly how to describe what I was feeling, because I haven't felt that way before or since. It was straight up fight or flight, and my logical mind was saying there was nothing out of the ordinary, while all of my senses were telling me I needed to run right now. Again, looking back and remembering this, I have no idea what this was. It's really hard to describe in writing actually. It was like I was being taunted almost, and I felt that. The presence of some animal or some person was down that trail, and for some reason I knew it knew that I knew it was there, even though I couldn't actually see it. That's what still scares me to this day. Somehow I could just tell that it knew. It was bright enough out for me to see down the trail 30 yards back no problem, but I still couldn't see anything. This was maybe about 30 seconds of looking down there, if that. I was panicking, but I still wasn't sure what to think. I wasn't exactly seeing anything threatening. I turned around and started walking at a quick pace. I mean, what else could I really do? I knew for a fact that if it was a guy out to kill someone, he was probably most likely going to end up killing me on this trail, or in my tent after following me back. At this point, why even run? That was my logical thought. I would say it was not even a minute into the quick trek back when I heard what can only be described as a rushing sound or swooping air, followed by what sounded like a rake sliding across the dirt trail, the former sound happening right after the latter. It happened 4 times, and each time they were getting progressively closer to me. 20 yards back, 15 yards back. Looking back, I don't know how I was able to stay composed in that moment and not soil myself. Somehow, though, I mentally stayed focused on getting back to my tent. I ignored the panic and kept walking quickly, not daring to look back. Whoever or whatever it was followed me for the majority of the next hour. I just kept heading forward, though, and still did not look back. A few minutes from my camp location, that fight or flight feeling gradually but succinctly left, and I crawled into my tent. I couldn't sleep a single wink that entire night. When morning came, I looked around and walked back the way I came in. I did see some tracks, but I don't know exactly what they were. Perhaps a mountain lion or something. I'm just glad I never had to actually deal with it. I used to do a lot of camping and hunting with my dad back in the day. We lived in Michigan, so going up north was a common activity for us. I think the main difference between us and other people who did the same thing was that my dad liked to go way off the beaten path, like really, really deep into the woods. Often he would end up parking the truck somewhere once we couldn't go any further, and we would hike for several miles on carrying all of our gear. The very last time we went camping was definitely the weirdest one. My dad was really excited because he had just gotten a new full-wheel drive. He wanted to see just how far he could push this thing. After a lot of driving and some quite scary I thought I was going to die experiences, we ended up in this really small clearing. It was nearly dark out at this time, so we quickly made up a tent, had some food, and went to bed. When we woke up the next morning and it was bright out, we got a better idea of the clearing. It seemed to have been a common campsite, or at least that was the evidence. There was an area someone had a fire, firewood, and the grass was compressed in other areas too, like someone had walked there for a while. I think there may have also been some trash littered about as well. As we continued to explore this area further, I found what I called a swamp. It was like a bed of water where trees and branches had fallen into and were growing out of. It had a very eerie quality, but more than the atmosphere, I was afraid of hidden snakes. After checking that out, my dad decided we were going to walk even further into the forest. The trees were extremely thick here, and there was no way our truck would be able to get through. We were walking for maybe an hour or so when we came upon a second clearing. Before we even got close, though, we could hear something in the distance. As we approached further, we began to discover the source. The area went immediately from this extremely dense forest into this open area with low grass, and directly in front of us was an old wooden cabin. In front of it there were rusted-out cars that seemed to be impossibly placed due to just how dense the trees around were. To the left of us was this huge cliff that seemed to shoot straight down. Coming from the cabin was that noise. As we approached further, we could tell immediately it was a woman screaming. What she was screaming, I wasn't quite sure. I couldn't make it out, but she was obviously raving mad about something. I remember wanting to check out the cliff more, but my dad stopped me very suddenly. He stared like he was trying to figure something out and told me to turn back around immediately. We began sprinting back to the campsite, and when we got there, he immediately had us pack up everything, get back into the truck, and leave right away. I'm not sure what it was he saw that made him react like that, but it was enough to really scare him, which I had never seen before. We were both armed, and my dad had earned various medals in the army for rifle use and sharpshooting. He was an amazing shot, and when he had his gun with him, his bravery seemed endless. I think that's what creeps me out the most about this experience. Whatever this was that scared him, he knew he couldn't protect me or himself from it, even with his gun on him. So, this is not crazy as some things you've perhaps heard on here, but it's a genuine experience that's always had me wondering. I work as a broadcast engineer, and a few years ago I received a phone call at around 9:30 or 10 p.m. from the on-duty ENG that our OTA, over-the-air signal, had gone out. We were off the air on our OTA platform. The call was with several other ENGs, as well as my boss at the time. We had figured out that the problem was our transmitter, and it needed to be corrected manually. My boss asked for someone to volunteer to go with him, and after a few seconds of awkward silence, I offered to go. So our RF transmitter site was located on top of Beacon Mountain in Beacon, New York, which was about an hour plus from our station. At the time, I had never actually been up there, so of course, going in the middle of the night was quite spooky. I met my boss and we drove down together. We got to the mountain a little bit before midnight. The road up to the mountain to the transmitter site was a long, narrow, windy, and steep dirt road, with a lot of big, loose rocks as well. The drive up was scary enough on its own. I can't emphasize enough just how dark this drive was either. It was completely pitch black. A few times while going up, we would see headlights coming towards us, of people out with their off-road Jeeps. This wouldn't be as weird if it weren't in the middle of the night. We also saw 2 different campfires deep off into the woods, which I assumed were groups of locals hanging out and drinking or something. My boss told me that locals tended to hang out near the transmitter site sometimes and should be avoided at all costs. They had a tendency to be very sketchy. It didn't seem too sketchy to me, but what did I know? It was my first time there after all. My boss also told me he never traveled to that mountain without a gun. He said it was more than just the locals. I've seen stuff out here I can't really explain. We get to the top, do our work on the transmitter, and close up everything. We had just started to head back down. As we were going, we were at this particularly steep part of the road, where you pretty much have to ride your brake because the car won't stop till the incline levels out a little. All of a sudden, 3 deer sprinted out in front of us, not even looking at our oncoming car. This caused us to swerve since we were already riding the brake. The front of the car smacked against a rock, which stopped our momentum. My boss instantly turned the car off, and once the sound of the engine died, we could hear something big running in the opposite direction away from the road, up the natural slope of the hill. I shined my flashlight in that direction, but whatever it was already out of sight. We could still see branches moving though, and leaves being disturbed by whatever was moving that way. I asked my boss if he thought that was another deer or possibly a bear. He replied to me, "Can't be, bears run on all 4s. Whatever that was ran on 2 legs. And bears don't usually actively hunt deer anyway. Something was definitely chasing them." When we first heard footsteps, I would estimate they were as close as 10 to 15 feet from the car. The thing had started to run away, but now it appeared to be standing over us, as there was a natural incline up the mountain. There are a lot of logical explanations for this, like my boss was just trying to scare me, or perhaps it was a local walking or running through the woods, but there are a few things to consider here. Yes, it could have been a person walking alone through the woods, but why would all those deer be running away from them, and why would it be chasing them? Why would they run away from our car and hide to watch us as well? Also, whatever ran away there was out of sight very quickly, within 3 to 4 seconds of starting to run uphill. I imagine a person would have to be in the greatest shape ever to run that quickly up this steep hill, but what do I know? It sounded too big to be a bobcat or mountain lion or coyote, but I'm not too experienced with that sort of thing, so it's entirely possible. My boss is not the kind of guy that would try to scare people. He's a very stern, all-business type of guy. He seemed pretty rattled as well by this and wanted to get out of there ASAP. I ended up going back to that mountain many more times before leaving for a new job, but I never saw or heard anything like that night. I also never went back after sunset though. I no longer work for this company, and the company no longer owns that transmitter site anyway, so likely I'll never have a reason to go back. I don't know of any reported sightings or experiences with anything in that area, but I do know that over the years there have been an abnormal number of car accidents over that road. I assume most of them are due to the poor conditions, but it really makes me think. I was almost killed 6 years ago by a friend, and it kind of dabbles into the paranormal at times. This took years for me to be able to talk about. I'm still dealing with the PTSD associated with this event. So 6 years ago, myself and a male friend who we'll call Sam decided we wanted to go camping. I'd known him for years, and he was one of my best friends. I wasn't weirded out by going camping alone with him because of this. I decided to invite a girlfriend along though too. The more the merrier after all. We decided to go camping at the spot I hadn't been to in a couple of years. I still remembered the basic general description to get there though. We stopped at a gas station outside the last tiny town and asked to make sure we were going the right way. The attendant pointed and said, "Follow the storm." Sure enough, huge black clouds were forming in the direction of our campsite. I mean, this is to date the most terrifying storm cloud I'd ever seen. And what's a story without a crazy storm, am I right? We sit in the car and discuss possibly going home, but being the badasses that we are, we decided to tough it out instead. We all like camping in the rain during storms anyway. So, we start driving onto this dirt road in the middle of nowhere. As we're getting closer to the campsite, I start to feel this horrible feeling. Just horrible. There's no way to really explain it. I just had this indistinct feeling that something bad was going to happen. We eventually decided to turn around because the storm was so bad. The lightning was hitting right outside our car, and it seemed way too dangerous to continue. We started to head back towards town, but the second we leave the forest, boom, no storm. Well, okay. The storm is localized in the area, it seemed. So we'll just go camp somewhere else. About 20 minutes from our town, there's a reservoir with a man-made lake and a few camping spots in various areas. We park there instead, pack up our stuff, and start on the trail that runs around the lake so we could find a spot with a bit more privacy. The spot where we parked our car was right at the opening to the trail, and a couple was camped at a spot right there. We stopped and chatted casually with them. They seemed pretty cool, so we invited them to head our way in about an hour. After we'd set up shop, we'd all play games and drink together. We get to our spot and set up camp, and I randomly get a text message on my phone from another friend. This was weird because cell service was super shoddy out in this area. She was an artist friend of mine whose stars have risen greatly in the last few years. I explained to her where we were. She said, "Great. I've been looking for a really big fire recently. I'm on my way." Kind of an odd statement, but artists are strange people, I guess. She smokes a lot of weed as well, so I don't understand half of what she says half of the time. So let's fast forward time here for the sake of my story. We're having a great time, that other couple comes over, and we're drinking, having a blast. My artist friend shows up with this monstrosity of a statue. She said she made it in her college freshman art class, and it had brought her bad luck for 4 years or something. She wanted to burn it in the fire. I wish to God I had some sort of bad feeling about it or something, but I'm not really one to believe in supernatural weird things. We all laughed and threw it in the fire. Fast forward a couple hours, my artist friend brought her weed out and smoked with my friend Sam for a couple of hours as well. Now, Sam was mixing liquor and weed. Rita and I don't smoke. It started to get dark, and the new couple headed back towards their camp. My artist friend decided to head home, since she wasn't planning on spending the night. It was just us original three now. About this time, Sam started to act very weird. We laughed it off as cross-faded, which nearly cost me my life. It started off with him changing his voice. He went from normal tones to very low, dark, and gravelly. He sounded almost like a different person. We thought he was just getting more fucked up. Then it got even worse, though. He started to babble nonsense. It started off pretty quietly, but it got more understandable as he went on. He pulled Rita aside and told her he worked for the CIA, had millions of dollars in offshore accounts, and could make any of us disappear in an instant and get away with no issue. Please keep in mind this is one of my absolute best friends, and I never felt the least bit scared around him. We just laughed off these veiled threats. Haha, okay, drunk ass. About this time, though, Rita noticed that her hatchet we were using for firewood had suddenly gone missing. We searched everywhere, but it was just way too dark. We gave it up as a lost cause until sunup. Sam was still muttering dark nonsense to himself, sitting on the opposite side of the fire pit. Eventually, he passed out. Rita and I stayed up, chuckling about how weird he was acting, and congratulating ourselves on a pretty fun night. About an hour later, we start to feel raindrops. That damn storm we'd driven away to avoid is getting ready to dump all over our heads. Oh well, it's late. We'll get drunky in the tent and go to bed. This is where shit gets real, though. We shook him gently until he moaned. We explained that it was starting to rain. Time to go to bed. He struggled up, and Rita and I each grabbed a side and hauled him to the tent. We stopped in front of the tent to unzip it. When Sam totally just went nuts, it was out of this world, like he was possessed by the devil himself. I'm not even being dramatic about this. He just randomly started screaming, this horrible high-pitched sound I'll never be able to get out of my nightmares. I was bent over, so I missed the swing that got Rita thrown back. He turned around, quite gracefully I might add, drunken stupor almost totally gone, and kicked out the last coals from the fire. This was happening in a matter of seconds, but time was slowed down for me. I remember every tiny detail. So the fire is out now. The campsite is 100% pitch black. No moon because of those storm clouds above. The next thing I know, Sam is standing next to me. So close I could feel him breathing. Then all of a sudden I'm on the ground. I was hit hard enough for the air to be completely knocked out of me. Not that I'd be able to breathe anyways, because Sam was now sitting on my stomach with his hands wrapped very tightly against my throat. He was strangling me with all of his very significant strength. Sam was one of those super tall muscular types that had those crazy long monkey arms. I was reaching up trying to push him off me, but his arms were so damn long I could barely even touch his chest. I was scraping at his arms and buckling underneath him, trying to get him off of me. I could hear Rita screaming my name, trying to find where I was. At this point, I was starting to black out. It seemed like an eternity, but in reality, it was probably a few minutes tops. Through my quickly fading vision, I could see Rita now punching and fighting Sam, trying her hardest to get him to let go. She was a rugby player, so she's pretty scrappy. I blacked out for a few minutes here, so I only have Rita's version of the story to go on after this. After I went limp, apparently Rita freaked out. I mean, understandably, she thought he had just killed me. She went into overdrive and started kneeing him in the face. After a few hits, that was enough to stun him and make him let go. She pushed him aside and hauled me up, still unconscious. Seriously, go Rita. Dead weight is no easy thing to manage. I guess I was out for a couple of minutes, but when I came to, she was dragging me down the path crying quietly. I came to pretty full force, and I immediately freaked out. Hysterics naturally. Screaming, crying, shaking uncontrollably. Rita was telling me to shush. Sam hadn't followed us apparently, but we certainly didn't want him to start now. I managed to control myself a bit and started carrying my own weight to walk. To add insult to injury, my flip-flops had fallen off during the attack, and now I was walking barefoot on a horribly rocky path. This was not pleasant, and I could feel the cuts forming already. Rita, being the fucking badass she is, took off her sandals and let me have them. Seriously, this girl is better than Jesus. From our campsite to the parking lot was about 15 minutes, probably longer with my recent trauma, but it was still silent behind us. Sam seemed to have been left far behind. When we were close enough to the new couple's camp, which was right next to the parking lot, we started screaming for help. The girl, being reasonably frightened, stayed in the tent, but the guy came out to the path to find out what was wrong. We explained the whole attack an almost dead situation. He pulled out his gun with the intention of walking back to our campsite to confront Sam. Luckily, his girlfriend came out at this point and convinced him that instead of a murder charge, it would be far better to instead get a cell service so we could call 911. We were walking towards their car when we realized there was a camp manager a couple hundred yards away. Perfect. We headed towards that. Knocked on the door, cried hysterically, and explained everything that was going on. A very nice lady got us some water bottles while her husband called the police. They sat us on their couch to wait, and for some reason, I remember seeing there were 5 deadbolts on the door. There was no way Sam was getting through that. A half hour later, about a dozen cops and an ambulance showed up. The cops took our story and headed up to find Sam, asking if he was armed. We said we don't know. We explained the missing hatchet and the knife I had in my purse. They go out armed. Rita and I still loaded into the ambulance. An officer came to the door before it closed and stated that they found Sam. He was still waiting at the campsite. He was also completely naked, bleeding from the minor wounds Rita and I had managed to inflict, holding that hatchet and laughing. The officer said he was mumbling something about being possessed by the devil, still talking total nonsense. The officer asked if he had done any drugs. We said he'd smoked and drank as well. Perhaps the weed could have been laced by something. The rest is fairly dull. My first ever ambulance ride, a very pricey emergency visit, a lot of drugs, and a CT scan to check for internal swelling in my neck. They wanted to keep me overnight, but there was no way that was going to happen. My cat is my therapy animal and he was home. I was going home now, end of story. To add insult to injury, when I got home I realized that because I'd been having roommate troubles, I'd locked my bedroom door with my cat inside, and my keys had been left at the campsite. I could hear him meowing through the door while I just sobbed my eyes out, locked on the other side. I was too loaded up on drugs to go anywhere, so Rita, in a final spur of awesome, went with her mom and went out to get all of my stuff. All of us were at 24 hours of no sleep. So, that's my story. The rest is the obvious stuff. Charges, prosecution, court, a lot of physical and mental anguish. He pled guilty. The judge asked him if he wanted to make a statement, but he didn't. I never got an apology for almost ending my life. Sometimes I guess there's no definite closure. I never believed in bad luck, superstition, possession, or any of that stuff, but I'm 100% positive burning that stupid statue is what caused him to snap that night. He wasn't a dangerous person, and he had never been violent before. That statue brought my artist friend bad luck, and clearly had some bad spirits or something in it that we let go. That's the most detailed account I've ever given about this event. I call it I attend a group therapy program at the eastern edge of Katy Country, on Cape Cod. We've lost several people, either because they just stopped coming or they graduated. My first week there this May, it was a gentleman who was there for about 2 days. Then he just stopped coming altogether. He smoked like a chimney, so every break he'd be out in the smoking area. I sat down and introduced myself. He introduced himself to me as Ralph. Ralph seemed to smoke a butt in just one drag. This impressed me, but at the same time made me wince a bit. As he was lighting up another cigarette, he began to mumble to himself. Then, out of nowhere, he started talking to me about serial killers. Now, I'm on the autism spectrum, and I have just a tad bit of trouble reading people.
Yeah, dude, I'm so done with my girlfriend. I want to kill her, then fuck the ever-living shit out of her body and tell her I won.
At first, I didn't think I could have possibly heard him correctly. I asked if he could repeat what he'd just said, and he repeated word for word. By this time, other people were now coming out to smoke. Sarah, one of the people in the dual diagnosis group, came over and sat at the table. I think she could tell that in this moment Ralph was becoming unhinged. He dragged her into the conversation too.
Yeah, so I'm gonna go Ted Bundy on my girlfriend. Gonna kill her, then fuck her body. You think that's a good idea, right?
Sarah got wicked angry. Sarah and I immediately got up and went inside, and moments later we reported him. Minutes later, a cruiser and ambulance showed up to haul him off, and we haven't heard from him ever since. This is why I hate the fact that state hospitals in Massachusetts are closing. We get folks like Ralph. Ralph obviously needs help, and I really don't hope we ever cross paths with him again. I also hope the cops informed his girlfriend in the end too. This takes place in Grand Rapids, Michigan. About 18 years ago, when I was 17 or 18 years old, I was living across the state from Grand Rapids. I was a senior in high school, and I had a lot of friends who had recently graduated and gone off to college. One particular weekend, a friend and I decided to take a trip to see some of our old friends from high school and spend the weekend at their house. When we got there, we realized the house was down this weird dead-end street. It was like a normal city neighborhood, but you could turn down this one almost unnoticeable street that looked almost like an alleyway, and there were about 5 to 10 houses down it. They were all in really bad shape. When we got there, it was a really big and old 5-bedroom house. There were a couple people living there. Most of them I was just meeting for the first time. We met and all got along pretty well. We were all having a great time together, actually. Then they started telling me, though, about how weird this street was, and how all the neighbors had been living there for a really long time. We started partying, and my friend started telling me he loved living in the house. Things were a bit weird, though, because he was a really curious dude. He said the landlord had told them specifically when they first moved in that he knew they were going to be partying a lot and doing typical young college kid stuff. He told me after the landlord told him he didn't care what they did. The only rule he had in the house, and he was very adamant about this, was to never under any circumstances try to open the doors to the basement. Obviously, this point piqued my interest as well. After a brief discussion, we headed down to see it. It was striking. Now, to set this up visually, the basement was like one of those very old basements where everything is made out of cement. It was super dirty and long, and had big cement support pillars down the middle. There was nothing in it. On the other side of the room were these doors, big, huge doors, and when I saw them, my heart sank. I could see both doors had about 1,000 nails in them, all over. Some were bent and sticking out. It looked like the wood was cracked, and like someone had been frantically nailing this thing shut as hard as they could. Both of them. We discussed it for a while, and decided not to open those doors. Honestly, I kind of regret it. I still think about it from time to time. I have no idea what was behind them. We've discussed so many possibilities. What, an old unused well? If so, why would they be on both sides of the house? Maybe some old tunnels or catacombs, maybe. The house was really old. The ultimate reason my friend didn't want to open those doors in the end is because he was afraid a poltergeist was trapped in or something. I just laughed that off. I don't even think the house is actually still there, but I know they asked the landlord again what was behind those doors. All he would ever say is, "Just promise me you'll never try and open them." How strange. I was in high school in the early 1990s. This was around the time when Nirvana came out, and pretty much changed music and culture all at the same time. A lot of the kids that I grew up with in my whole life began acting a lot different around this time. I mean, I guess that happens a lot anyway when you get to high school, but these were some pretty drastic changes. A lot of my friends basically turned punk overnight. It was quite odd to see a guy who was one day a prep come to school the next day with a big mohawk. But yeah, that was the last time I recall where culture just completely changed overnight. It wasn't just people changing their looks and stuff though. A lot of people drastically changed the way they acted too. I mean, I really didn't change a whole lot myself, but I did begin hanging out with some different people, and a few of my own friends changed quite a lot as well. One of my best friends throughout my entire life had been a guy named Josh. Josh and I had been friends since maybe the 3rd or 4th grade. He was not really a nerd, nor a jock, nor anything else really. He was just a guy, really light blonde hair and blue eyes. Like me, he didn't really do a lot of extracurricular activities. We'd mostly just hang out, play Nintendo, and do things like that. Josh changed a whole lot though when we were sophomores in high school. The first really notable thing he did is that he dyed his hair jet black. It was hard to get used to because his hair had been really light colored before he changed it. He also began dressing a lot differently as well. He was like me, a t-shirts and jeans guy up until that point. He began dressing though like his entire wardrobe had come completely from Hot Topic or something. He also started to get several facial piercings, which I assumed were against his parents' wishes. Josh also started listening to differing music. He would always comb through the music store shelves trying to find CDs by bands that no one knew. It was like he thought it made him more special or something if he was the first big fan the band had. Despite these changes though, our friendship didn't really change that much. I mean, he did start hanging out with other people somewhat. Generally, whoever had a car and some money, he would be in their car and cruising around with them. But he never stopped hanging out with me. We still got together all the time. We'd just play video games and talk about stuff like nothing had ever changed. One night, he showed at my house pretty late at night though. My parents had already gone to bed, and he normally would never show up that late. I was up though, so I let him in. He seemed really distressed about something, so we went into my room to talk for a bit. I noticed one of his arms was all bandaged up, but I didn't ask anything about it at first. I was worried he was high on something due to the strange way he was acting. I don't remember most of what we talked about, but when I noticed that he was now bleeding beneath his bandages, I asked him if someone had hurt him. He immediately told me that no one had, but when I asked him if he'd hurt himself then, he was all too eager to tell me. Taking off his jacket, he showed me the fresh bandages that were absolutely bleeding underneath. He asked if I wanted to see his injury. I didn't really know how to respond to that. I just told him that I didn't think it was a very good idea for him to take those bandages off. It was obvious that he was bleeding profusely, and removing those bandages could just make it that much worse. He did not listen to me though. Josh started unwrapping the bandages of his arm, and when he did, I was shocked at what I had seen. His arm was crisscrossed with straight razor cuts. I mean, they looked almost like hashtags, so I knew they had to have been deliberate. That's the moment I knew that either he had been cutting himself, or he had someone else cutting his arm for him. Either way, I was very disturbed. I asked him about it, and he told me that he had been cutting himself a lot lately. He told me it was a rushed feeling to do it, and he'd felt flat emotionally a lot lately. Cutting himself sort of brought him out of that. I didn't want to judge him or betray his trust in telling me this, so it wasn't like I was going to tell anyone. I did encourage him though to clean the wounds. He could get an infection if he just left them like that. I told him I had a first aid kit and could give him some bandages too. I went to that kit while worrying about my friend. When I came back to the room, he was still sitting there on the floor in the dim light. I got ready to help him and reached forward to grab his arm. Then though, Josh reached out quickly and slashed me all the way down the forearm with a razor blade I hadn't even noticed was there. It was so sudden I didn't even feel the pain at first. I was more shocked that he had done it at all. I looked at Josh right in his face. He had this weird little smile on his lips and a strange look of happiness in his eyes. That look very quickly deflated. Before I could get up or react in any way, Josh got up and sprinted out of my house. It was a really freaky moment. I wasn't sure what to do, but I had to get my parents up to take me to the hospital. I didn't know if the blade Josh had used was clean, and it was a pretty deep cut as well. I didn't want to take any chances. What I didn't do, however, is tell anyone what he had done to me. Josh avoided me for a long time after that. It wasn't until a very, very long time after where the two of us talked. He told me he had only cut me because he wanted me to feel the rush he felt when he cut himself. When he realized he had badly scared me, though, it freaked him out, and he ran out of the house. He was too scared to confront me after, thinking I was very upset with him. I don't hold any ill will for it, but I'll never forget that moment of fear when he grabbed my arm and just slashed me open like that. There's a gas station / convenience store that I go to nearly every single day. I walk there, so I do it not really to get anything, but because it's a pretty good midday walk to get a bit of exercise. It keeps me going, getting up to do something every day. There's a guy I know who is homeless now, but only assumed it in the first few times I met him. He often hangs out right outside of that convenience store. There's a shady little spot in the front next to the propane tanks that has an outlet. I guess the managers of the store allow him and 1 or 2 other homeless people in our small town to use that outlet in order to recharge their phones. Well, anyway, he had stopped me in front of this store to talk a few times. Although I couldn't really understand everything he was talking about, I had been homeless once before for a short time. I know what it's like to not have anyone you can talk to. So, I let him talk a whole lot to me while I worked as a good sounding board. Just recently, he decided to get up and walk with me as I was on my way home from the store. He suggested that I should walk a different way instead. I had told him before the area in which I lived, and apparently there was a road that went behind the stores and came out behind another street which was close to my home. He told me he would show me how to get to the trail he was talking about. The weirdest part, though, is that he didn't walk with me all the way to where the trail was. He walked as far as the train tracks and then just pointed me the rest of the way. And, actually, he was right. It was a much quicker path to get to the way I was going. It was also a lot more shaded and solitary than walking along the busy highway. I found myself enjoying it quite a bit, actually. I would take that way a few times in the day, not really thinking too much about it. It was when I decided to take it once at night, though, that I had a really scary experience. I hadn't stopped to really think about what it might be like to walk back there at night. The actual path was really short, and most of the walk was along a paved road. There were a few homes along the road, so I assumed there would at least be some street lamps alongside as well. Well, when I crossed over from the little path to the asphalt road, needless to say, I was surprised at first by just how dark it was. And yeah, it was really darker than anything I could ever recall in my life. Like I mentioned, there were a few houses along the road, but they didn't seem to have any lights on at this time of night. In fact, there were absolutely no lights on at all, not on any of the telephone poles even. This meant it was a downhill walk that was nearly pitch black outside. I couldn't even really make out where I was going forward, trying to watch the ground to see where I was going. For some reason at the time, it never occurred to me to just turn around and go back. I wanted to get through walking that way, and I just figured after I would take the rest of the normal way home. After a few moments, it occurred to me to use the flashlight on my cell phone. Sure, it wasn't the best light there could be, but it did help me find my way a little bit better than without. I couldn't really see what was on the sides of me or anything behind me either, but it was enough to keep me from stumbling on or even off the road. Suddenly, though, there was some noise off to the left side of me. I jumped and tried to shine my light over in that direction. Because the light was so weak, I wasn't able to make out what was off to the side. I could see, though, that there was some sort of figure stumbling in a weird gait toward me. He was saying something like, "Give me that! Give me that!" I didn't need to make out who or what it was in order to run, though. I took off like a rocket down that hill without even looking back once. I ran and didn't stop until I made it to the store. When I went in, I was startled, and the cashier could tell something was wrong. While catching my breath, I explained what happened. When we went outside, though, that person had completely disappeared into the darkness. I guess whoever it was didn't decide to follow me in the end, but it sure was creepy as hell having them come after me in the dark like that. I should start this by telling you that I don't defend the way that my friends and I behaved when this all happened, but that still doesn't make this story any less scary to me at all. When I was growing up, we lived right on the edge of the rural side of town. We didn't really live out in what I'd consider living in the country, but we did live quite far out of town on a gravel road, so it seemed rural to me. There was this older man who lived just down the road from us. I don't really remember what his name was, but we called him Mr. Crabapple at the time. I highly doubt that was his actual name, though. He did have some fruit trees in his backyard, but as far as I can remember, none of them were actually crabapple trees. We might have just called him that because he was a grumpy old man, and we were all annoying-ass children. I had to have been around 10 years old when this happened. In the fall, normally after school, a lot of us kids on the street would be playing outside. Inevitably, we would go and try to steal some fruit off of his trees. It was at the time of year they would be ripe and ready to pick. This was not a week after we started back at school. We hadn't really bugged the old man at all during the summertime, so we went and wanted to go and steal some fruit off his trees. Normally, we would get him to chase one of us away from his porch so we could all sneak into the backyard and take some of the fruit. A friend of mine went up to the porch and knocked on his door. When he answered, the kid began mocking him, which is what we did to get him angry. He got real mad and came outside and began chasing the kid around. Of course, the job of the decoy kid was to lead him far away from the house. Boy, did he do his job real well. The rest of us ran into the backyard. Well, apparently, we had done this way too many times and he had caught on. While we were in his backyard trying to get the fruit, I felt someone grab me really forcefully on the arm. I screamed, and when I did, all of the other kids turned around. We all noticed the old guy had grabbed me from behind and began pulling me towards his house. Of course, kids being kids, rather than any of them try and help me out, they just scattered and ran away. The man dragged me into his home and slammed the back door behind him. He then took me and threw me down a flight of stairs into his basement. I then heard him lock the door. I was terrified. Only 10 years old, I wondered what was going to happen to me. I wondered if my friends would go and tell my parents, or if they'd just run home and pretend like nothing happened so they wouldn't get in trouble. It was hard to know exactly how kids like us were going to behave. I was not only in this man's basement all by myself, it was more of a cellar, and it was extremely dark and dank. It was so terrifying to be in there all alone, listening to that man pacing around above me. Who knows what he was planning for me? It took a while, and I don't really know how long I was down there in the basement. It felt like quite a long time. I had cried quite a bit because I was so scared. I finally heard a knocking on the door. There was some arguing that I heard as well. I was still scared, not really knowing what was going on. I then heard the door unlock and watched it open. My dad was up at the top of the stairs. He told me to come up and that we were now going home. I ran up the stairs to him quickly. He picked me up and we left the house. Although my dad was mad at me for tormenting the old guy, he also felt that throwing me into his basement and terrifying me like that was way too much. Turns out one of my friends had gone to my parents' house and told them, but only after his own parents made him do it. That was why I was in that basement for such a long time. I did get punished for what I did, but I never ever bothered that man again. Back when I was in my early to mid-teens, around 2007 to 2008, a bunch of friends and I would regularly hang out in an old abandoned school. It was a very small school with only 8 classrooms, a teacher's room, a cafeteria, 2 bathrooms, and one room we had no idea what it was, since it was always locked. I'll get back to that later though. This school hadn't been able to keep up with the 80s modernization of our town, and the large number of newcomers that followed with it. As such, it quickly closed down in favor of newer, bigger schools and buildings. By the end of the 80s, most of the place was boarded up completely, but you could enter through a window in one of the classrooms, where the board had since been ripped down. Our routine was always the same. Whoever of us got off school first would go down to the building and go through the different rooms to make sure everything was empty and safe. These buildings had earlier been known as the local spot for drug addicts, and used needles and such were a common sight for us at this point. This one day, a friend of mine and I were the first to get off of school. As per usual, we took the walk down to the building. Upon entering and stepping out from the classroom though and out into the hallway, we immediately saw a large man standing there. I remember him being quite huge, but that might possibly be only how he appeared to us kids. My friend let out a huge scream. The man didn't seem shocked or scared though to see us there. In fact, he didn't seem to react to us at first. Eventually, he turned around though and asked us,
"Hey, have you guys seen insert my friend's name here?"
We told the guy we haven't seen anyone and only just got there. He sighs and shrugs and then pushes past us to leave the very same way we just entered. Now, our friend had an unusual name, so the chances this guy was just looking for another random person who just so happened to have that same name were pretty low. Thing is, none of us had ever seen this guy before. I happened to know most of said friend's family as well. When we described what the guy looked like to our friend, he didn't seem to know who this guy could have been either. For the next few months, we were too scared to go back. When we did return about 3 to 4 months later, it was in the middle of summer vacation. We thought it would be fun to climb up on the roof of the building and sunbathe. Upon climbing it, we found the roof to be rather weak and close to caving in. Something, though, made us take the risk and dare to venture out onto that weak roof after all. There was a hole in the roof, directly above the room we had never been able to get into. The hole in the roof was only about the size of a football. One of my friends came up with the idea to lower her arm down into the hole and film the rest of the room using her phone so we could all see what the room looked like. She puts her arm down into the room, and as she begins filming, she suddenly lets out this blood-curdling scream. She immediately retracted her arm, but now her phone could no longer be seen. She was certain that something had just grabbed it from her hand. As we looked down through the hole, we could now see her phone just lying straight up on the floor. We climbed down from the roof and entered the building, now intent on doing whatever it would take to get into that room. After all, we didn't want our friend to have to return home without a phone and have to explain what happened to her parents. About 30 minutes later, we finally managed to make a hole in the door and put our hands inside. When we tried to use the door handle on the inside, the door now opened right up without any trouble. We stepped inside and all stared in silence. To this day, I have no idea what this room could possibly be doing in a school building, and I sincerely hope it had never been used for what it looked like it was intended for. The room was about 4 by 4 meters. The floor and walls were all made of solid concrete. In the left corner of the room where we entered were 2 large metal bowls sitting on the floor. At the back of the room were 5 chains dangling from the wall, 4 with equal-sized cuffs, and 1 large one that looked just perfect to fit around someone's neck. Needless to say, we swiftly picked up my friend's phone and immediately left that place. The room had us both scared but slightly intrigued as well. After some talk back and forth that same night, we decided to go back and take a closer look again the following day. When we returned the next day, though, we found that door locked once again. Only now, someone had covered the hole we had made in the door with a large wooden board, nailed firmly shut. Once again, we immediately left, and after that visit, we never returned. I have no idea what we stumbled upon that day, but I'm certain my days hanging out at this place is what sparked my interest in abandoned places. Today, I'm quite an experienced member of the Urbex community, and have had much more sinister experiences with places like this that I might share with y'all some other time. Since taking up Urbex, it's been a dream of mine to go back to that school and check out if that room was still there. Unfortunately, though, that place no longer exists, and the area is now home to a thrift store instead. These events occurred 2 summers ago in the Grand Teton area. My boyfriend at the time, now husband, so let's call him H, was an avid outdoorsman and also served in the military. I was an ecology major and wanted to spend some more time outdoors, so he decided to take me on my first backpack, just the 2 of us. For those who aren't familiar, the Grand Tetons are well known for their wildlife, specifically grizzly bears. My only experience with bears up to this point was watching a little black bear cross the road from the safety of my car. Seeing grizzly country signs around every corner wasn't exactly doing much to calm down my nerves. The first incident. My boyfriend looked quite a lot like Indiana Jones with his machete hanging from his belt. large knives attached to each side of his pack, and bear spray strapped to his waist. You get the picture. The beginning of our 25-mile journey was all uphill. When in bear country, you're actually supposed to make noise so as to not startle the wildlife by accidentally sneaking up on it. As you can imagine, going up a steep hill while carrying a 40-pound pack makes it quite difficult to make idle conversation. We were about an hour in and almost to the very top of the ascent. I noticed that the woods around us had gone completely silent, save for the rushing stream that was to the left of our trail. Silent woods are never a good sign. This usually indicates predators nearby. At this point, I was in front of my boyfriend, and we were about to crest up the hill. For about 20 minutes, we had not said a single word to each other, having been way too tired to speak. We noticed the silence at the same time, and gave each other knowing glances. I came up over the top of the hill, and immediately froze. Sitting not 10 feet in front of me, right in the middle of the trail, was a grizzly bear. My husband wasn't aware yet, as he was behind me. I did the first thing I could think of. While still in my frozen stance, I managed to take my arm and start flinging it wildly behind me, trying to get H's attention. I was too terrified to even speak. The bear went immediately from sitting to all fours, not looking away from us once. H quickly swung me around so I was behind him, and he started yelling. Being in the military, he sure knew how to do it well. The grizzly wasn't quite fazed, as it started to walk slowly towards us. At this point, I was on the verge of passing out in terror. This bear was about 5 feet in front of us, when we heard a loud crack coming from the woods to our right. The bear heard it too, and he bolted toward the stream. A second crack boomed again, this time much closer than before. H said, "It's probably just some falling branches," but we knew that was not the case. At this point, we were walking quickly up the trail in an attempt to create some distance from that grizzly, and those strange noises as well. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand straight up, and at that very same moment, H stopped moving in front of me. He turned around to look at me, and I turned to look behind me. To this day, we're not sure what exactly we saw. Back where we had just been standing was this large black-brown mass. It looked to be 3 times bigger than that already large grizzly we had seen just a few moments before. Its back was facing us. Then it stood on its back legs. It looked similar to that bear we'd just seen, but something about it was different. At this point, it was probably stupid to run away, but that's exactly what we did. We were aware of heavy footsteps behind us, but neither of us looked back. Those footsteps eventually faded. At this point, I was a mess. H was doing his very best to console me. "Honey, this is extremely unusual. The bears usually stay away from humans. We're going to be okay. I'm sure that won't happen again." That was enough to convince me to continue on the backpack. Not an hour later, though, we reached a clearing where we decided to take a rest and eat a snack. About a minute after we sat down, I noticed bushes moving in a line toward the clearing towards us. Out of the brush came this adolescent grizzly, who looked just as spooked as I'm sure we did. He came straight for us. H, being the crazy nut that he is, decided to charge back at the bear while screaming, bear spray at the ready. That did the trick, though. The bear got scared and ran off. All I could think to myself was, just my luck. But that wasn't even close to what happened on the second night. Second night. Before we began our backpack, we had let the ranger station know which trails and route we planned to take. With this information, they usually send a ranger on horseback at some point during the backpack to make sure that everything is okay. There weren't many approved trails for us to choose from, and it was just our luck that they were the most difficult ones as well. Apparently, over the 3 days we were on those trails, we had been the sole hikers there. We didn't see a single other person once we were en route. Anyhow, I guess we missed the ranger who came to check on us. We had been following hoofprints the entire second day, and we hadn't seen any the day before. I had some foot problems, so we spent valuable daylight trying to adjust my boot, laces, and socks to compensate for the pain. When we started on the trail again, we had maybe an hour or two of daylight left, and in the woods, it gets dark real fast. I was exhausted now. It was already dark out, and H was the only one with a working headlamp. Mine wouldn't even turn on anymore for some reason. We needed to find somewhere to set up camp for the night, as we still needed to eat as well. It was freezing, and the wind was blowing quite fiercely. It was creating a howling sound as it rushed through the trees, which made it difficult to hear H or discern any other sounds coming out from the woods. After another hour of hiking through the dark, we finally found a clearing. Well, I guess it was more like a bowl. It looked to be 200 meters in diameter, with the sides being 10 meters down from the trail to the bottom of the clearing. This place was strange. We both felt it, though he didn't tell me how freaked out he was till after we had left. There was no moonlight, so all we had was the illumination from his headlamp, our small camp stove, and the flashlight I fished from my backpack. Half of the trees were dead and fallen just in the bowl. The vegetation everywhere else was quite dense. To help alleviate my anxiousness, he started playing Ninja Sex Party out of his portable speaker. This didn't help much though. It echoed off the trees, creating a dissonance of sounds. He also thought this loud noise would ward off any predators nearby though. This is when we knew our anxiousness was not just paranoia. The silence was back. There hadn't been a single bird chirp since we arrived at the clearing. It also may have had to do with the obnoxious music, but because of our previous experience, we decided to turn it off and head into the tent. It was freezing as well. As soon as we were situated in our sleeping bags, we could hear deep cracks and thuds echoing from beyond the tree line. Falling trees? There had been a lot of wildfires and very little rain this season. Thud. We both froze. That sound was not an echo. It came from inside the clearing and was definitely not a falling tree. Thud. A second one. It came from right outside the tent. We both stopped breathing. H's hand found mine and we clung together paralyzed. Something dragged along the outside of our tent, making an indent as it went along. We could see it was a finger. "What is it?" I whispered, shaking. "I don't know. It shouldn't be a person. We're the only ones on this side of the mountain." I was trying my hardest to stifle sobs, trying to listen to what was happening outside. I could hear steps around our tent, but I couldn't decipher what it was. The steps stopped, and then the whole side of the tent was slowly pushed inward. At this point, whatever was outside knew we were inside. I shined my flashlight at the side of the tent, and what I saw made my blood run cold. There was the shape of a human face pressed into the tent wall. I could make out their nose, an open mouth. Each time they breathed in, it made the tent around their mouth billow in and out. H said fuck that and pulled a Glock from his sleeping bag. He cocked it, and the sound shattered the silence. The face immediately pulled back, and we could hear fast footsteps heading toward the edge of the clearing. We didn't leave the tent till the sun was shining the next morning. The first thing we noticed was the smell of urine. We came out of the tent and looked around. Whoever that was had peed on the coals we left in the fire, leaving the disgusting stench of evaporated piss. Footprints surrounded our tent, circling around multiple times. Muddy handprints decorated the outside. At least, we think it was mud anyway. The takeaway? Wildlife is not always the most dangerous thing out in the back country. When I was 17, I worked in a large mall at Vans. I had a lot of creepy older guys come in and flirt with me, but one guy in particular took the cake. One day, I was working the usual busy as hell Saturday nights. There were 4 very tall men that asked for my help getting some shoes. I worked at an outlet, so the store was large with tall racks as well. The mall I worked in was extremely popular amongst locals and tourists alike. It also had some history with being a sex trafficking hotspot for some context. So anyway, the men said they were from Nigeria, and they were pretty chill at first, until they began the usual creepy flirting. One man kept saying he had a son in Nigeria, and asked if I wanted to wed him. I laughed because I thought he was joking, but suddenly he looked extremely offended. I was awkward and began talking about the shoes, but the man interrupted me. He kept on saying how great his son was, and that I would make a really great wife. At that point, I grew uncomfortable. I didn't want to be rude, so I asked for a coworker to come over and take care of them while I went to the bathroom. Everything was normal for the remainder of my shift. I clocked out and was waiting for my dad to come pick me up. Usually, I would walk around the halls of the mall as I waited. The music was soothing and all was calm. I walked past a restroom hall and saw figures standing in my peripheral. I glanced back. I saw it was the 4 men from earlier. I was in full-on panic mode at that point, but I played it off. I smiled at them softly and kept on walking so they didn't think I was being rude. Sure enough, though, they began to follow me immediately. I picked up my pace, hoping to find other people walking around, but there was not a single other person. I was speed-walking at this point, but the guys were now matching pace with me. My thought was to just go to the bathroom so I could try and lose them. I entered the next restroom hall. After going through a few corners, I walked slowly, thinking I must have lost them. Soon after, though, I could hear pounding footsteps in a hurry. I looked back, and they were now sprinting at me. I didn't think the bathroom would stop them anymore. I started screaming for help. I ran straight for the employee corridors of the mall. Luckily, right when I got through those doors, a security guard met me right on the other side. I bumped right into him, and I'd never felt more relieved in my life. The men immediately took off the other way. The guard let me stay in his office until my dad came. Thank God for that nice guard. If he hadn't been there, I wouldn't be writing this right now. My sister and I were both 16 and 13 respectively. We were home alone while my parents were out of state for a couple of days to attend the funeral of a longtime family friend. Our grandfather lived only a couple miles away and was originally supposed to babysit us, but he trusted that my sister and I would be fine on our own. Instead, he would be on call if anything were to go awry. Well, of course, something did. Just our luck, I guess. It was around 10 p.m. or somewhere close to that on the second night of being alone. I was upstairs in bed, trying to sleep after a long day of biking around with a couple of friends. Suddenly, my sister came sprinting up the stairs, which she almost never did unless she was in a hurry for whatever reason. She came into my room and was frantically speaking to someone on the phone. I laid there in confusion while she talked. I don't remember exactly what was said, but once she hung up, she hugged me tight and told me that everything was all right and Grandpa was on his way. It turned out what happened was that my sister had been sitting outside on our stoop talking to a friend of hers on the phone when this random pickup truck came slowly rolling onto our driveway. Well, my parents don't own a pickup, so immediately it threw up a red flag. Once it stopped, she saw a man get out carrying a duffel bag, and that's when she came running inside and called our grandfather. My grandfather may have been 60 at the time, but he was no pushover, being 6'4" and having the strength of Godzilla with a demeanor to match when it came to protecting his loved ones. He also owned plenty of firearms, which I didn't doubt for a second he would bring along in case shit really hit the fan. We lived in an area where the police would take quite a long time to reach us, so that was another reason why my sister called him immediately and not the authorities, just in case anyone was wondering why call him and not the police. Suddenly, we hear what sounds like a door being kicked open downstairs. Almost immediately afterwards, we began to barricade my bedroom door. None of the bedroom doors in the house had locks on them at that time. Once we were done, she looked out the window while I sat there, covering myself with a blanket. All the while, we could hear footsteps downstairs, walking about on our hardwood kitchen floor. My sister urgently looked around my room and asked if I had a bat or anything we could use to defend ourselves. I did, stored in my closet. My Louisville Slugger that I used when my parents had made me play baseball when I was in elementary school. I also had a hockey stick in there, but who would use that as a weapon unless in a very circumstantial situation? She rummaged through my closet and grabbed my bat, then stood next to the door while I ducked down behind her. I thought maybe I should grab that hockey stick, but it was very unwieldy for me. Unless the burglar had some sort of PTSD associated with hockey, this was not going to be a very effective weapon for me. We then heard the sound of a gunshot, followed by a man screaming out in pain. The sound of both I can still hear even to this day when I just think about it hard enough. My sister and I were standing by the door almost in tears, when about a minute later we hear our grandfather yell out our names, asking if we were all right. We both yelled out simultaneously that we were. My sister and I pulled the dresser and various other objects out of the way of my door, and we both went out into the hallway. We could hear my grandfather on the phone with 911 as we stood at the top of the stairs. When the police and the ambulance arrived, the man who had broken in was taken out on a stretcher, which I later learned was for a shot to the abdomen. My grandfather had come in through the same back door and found the man in our kitchen searching through drawers. He then came at my grandfather with one of our kitchen knives, and that's when he was shot. The man almost died from blood loss in the end, but he ended up surviving. I really hope he learned his lesson, both through being incarcerated and by being shot in the abdomen and almost losing his life. But of course, you never know with certain people, especially the nefarious ones. When I was 7 or 8, my family went to the beach and rented out a room. We had the kind of rooms where you rent out both and they connect through a door in the center. You know, there's like the doors to leave the room and then the doors to the other one. In the room connected to ours, there was this military family staying there. A typical military dad, some kids, and his wife as well. My older sister was supposed to be watching me that night, as we were down at the jacuzzi during the evening. As we were playing, hanging out, and having a generally good time, I didn't get out much, was naive, and all around a little kid. We were both white-skinned, blue eyes, and blonde hair, by the way. This mom just sits down in the jacuzzi with us. She started talking to us and was making herself very comfortable. I was an extremely naive kid, you see. Eventually, we started talking about books together. She started talking to us about her kids as well, who we had never seen around. We were actually having a pretty engaging conversation. Really in-depth, it felt like, at least for a small child. My sister decided she wanted to go back to the room, but I didn't want to go. I wanted to stay and talk with this interesting mom. Well, my sister went back to the room on her own. Now it was just 7-year-old me and some 40-something-year-old woman. This should have set off some creepy alarms, but it didn't for me. She starts talking about going and taking a walk on the beach. It was about 10 p.m. She wanted to go and walk along and collect some seashells. Well, wouldn't you know, I thought that was a real great idea. I'd get to walk on the beach at night and feel free like a big kid. I didn't need my sister or anyone watching over me. I run back to my room to tell my grandparents I'm going to take a walk on the beach with Sue, or whatever she said her name was. I remember my grandmother reading her book and barely even listening to what I said. She just shrugged me off. It's important to know I didn't live with my parents at the time. I start walking down the creepy motel corridor. As I'm going through the stairwell, it's like something straight out of a horror movie. Too bad I had never seen those kinds of movies at this age. I'm walking through this dark, dimly lit stairwell. The mom's way at the bottom, telling me to hurry up into the darkness. All this and that. While walking down the stairs, that army dad comes out of nowhere, running and hauling ass to where I was at. "Hey kid, your mom's calling you. It's really important. We gotta go right now." He basically grabbed me by the waist and lifted me up. Softly, not aggressively or anything. He led me back to our room. He knocked on the door and explained what had happened. I thought that was the end of it. I didn't really think too much out of everything until about a year ago, when this all suddenly came back to me. This woman was leading me away to the beach alone at night, so the army guy got a terrible feeling in his gut at that moment. He decided to intervene on the stairwell. When he told me my mom was out looking for me, since I didn't live with my mom, it set off some alarms inside my head. That's when I realized something was up. I didn't resist going back to my family. Even as a fairly naive kid, I knew since this man was saying my mom wanted me, it had to be something important. I'm 20 years old now, and I truly believe that mom was going to lure me away to do God knows what. The army dude thankfully intervened and probably saved my life. Thinking back, I get such a bad feeling all throughout my body. I now suspect I would never have made it back from that beach trip if I'd made it all the way down those stairs. This happened while I was in college 5 years ago. I was a transfer student and was 21 years old at the time. I was set up to be living in a building that was for students 21 or older and moved in a week and a half before classes began. This school was in northern Michigan, so when I first arrived, the campus was basically dead. I mostly kept to myself, but I was friendly with a few people in my building, namely one guy named Khalil, an exchange student from Lebanon. He seemed nice enough, though there was a distinct language barrier. Things could be fairly easily lost in translation. Our RD and RA, resident director and resident assistant, made everyone who had moved in have a meeting to go over the basic rules and whatnot. At the end of this meeting, as I was leaving the rec room, Khalil suddenly put his arm up on the wall in front of me, almost clotheslining me. It caught me off guard. I was a bit peeved and creeped out at this aggressive move. He began explaining to me that he would like to be my friend and would like to go out for dinner to get to know me. The way he worded it was quite odd. I wasn't exactly sure if this was a date proposal or just a friendly invitation. I just attributed it to his bad English. Like an imbecile, I felt cornered physically and socially. I'm quite awful with confrontation and can often be too nice. So I agreed to go. I soon found out that he meant right then and there, however, when he said, "I'll get us a taxi and we can go now." My introverted side was upset that my night of drinking and unpacking in solitude was being disrupted. I was not very excited, needless to say. If only I knew listening to that inner introvert might have saved me from a very unsettling experience. 10 minutes later, we're hopping into this taxi. As I'm entering, I just feel this sudden sense of dread. I think to myself, I barely know this guy, and the restaurant is miles away. I'll be stranded out there with this stranger if things get weird. As we drive onward, my guard only raises higher and higher. He wants to know everything about me, throwing out questions rapid fire, not just the normal getting to know you questions. My age, dating history, physical preferences, religion, everything. I was thinking, fuck, this is going to be so awkward. I wanted the night to be over before we even got there. At the restaurant, we both looked at the menu for a bit. The waiter came and took my order. Then he asked what Khalil wanted. "Oh no, I'm not hungry. I just wanted to watch her eat." What the fuck? Why would you ask me for dinner if you weren't hungry? Why the hell did you just want to sit there watching me eat? I was horrified. All of my family was in the lower peninsula of Michigan, 8 hours away. I had no friends up here. The only local numbers I had were my RA and RD. I speed eat my salad as Khalil watches me, now talking about himself. He told me how he had severe anger problems and was looking for a woman to help calm him, but still be a submissive traditional wife. I was trying to hide my growing horror and uneasiness as I just nodded along. He continued, explaining how he was infamous for his temper back home. His brothers often had to stop him from doing horrible things. At this point, red flags were basically blinding my vision. It was time to end this. I finished my food and told them to get a taxi back to campus. I intentionally sat in the front. I wasn't going to allow the possibility of any physical contact. When we got back, we get in the building. I say a quick thank you and immediately hauled ass back to my room. Door locked, I get into my sweats and chalked it up to just a weird experience. I vowed to avoid Khalil from then on. Around 12:30 a.m. though, I hear a knock at my door. I was watching Netflix minding my own business when I took out my earbuds to make sure I was hearing right. The knocking continued. Not a courteous knocking, but a closed fist furious pounding. I was petrified, making as little noise as possible. I I went to the door and looked out the peephole. I see Khalil standing there. My room was at the very end of a long hallway. All rooms around me were empty at this point. Knowing how isolated I was, I slunk away from the door, making zero noise and waiting for the knocking to stop. About a minute later, it did, and he growled through the door. "I know you're in there. I'll just wait if you won't open." My eyes widened in horror. I felt a mixture of rage and panic, but decided that confronting him then would not be smart. I quietly waited there, staring at the door until I fell asleep. I have no idea how long he actually waited. The next morning, when I finally emerged from my room, I found a couple of pages taped to my door. Oh God, 3 handwritten pages from Khalil, explaining his feelings for me and his intentions of making me his wife. I went straight to my RA and explained everything that happened. She agreed to meet with Khalil herself to explain to him how inappropriate he was being and tell him to leave me alone. Needless to say, he did not. Notes kept coming, and he showed up at my door dozens of times a day. I basically became trapped in my own room, having to hide away from this psycho. It lasted for 8 days altogether, but immediately when classes began, Khalil disappeared. I was told he had dropped out and moved back to Lebanon. I found it eerie how once actual school began, he just kind of vanished. Had he come here only to find a wife to take back with him? I guess I'll never know. So a bit of background info. I currently live with my parents. The house is 2 stories. There's an in-law apartment on the first floor, along with some other things as well. A garage bay, furnace room, laundry room, stuff like that. I live in the in-law apartment. My dad has been working with a contractor and some of his employees to replace the wall-mounted air conditioners. That means there's been a lot of people in and out of the house. The day this particular incident happened, my mom and I went out to do some grocery shopping, and my dad stayed home to direct the contractors. We got back and discovered that they were all gone. My dad had just gone to bed, so my mom and I made some dinner and hung out downstairs for a while. I remembered that I offhandedly mentioned to my mom that our cars were still outside. I talked about a woman whose car and house had been broken into just down the road. This creeped her out quite a bit, and she sent me downstairs to check to make sure the front door was locked. In fact, it was not. It was actually a little bit ajar. I closed it and locked the deadbolt, and then went back upstairs. We stayed upstairs together and watched TV for a few more minutes, until I suddenly heard a loud thump downstairs in the in-law apartment. I assumed this was my cat at first, getting antsy because I wasn't feeding her. I told my mom I was going to go downstairs to do so, and then come back up to finish the episode. As I walked down the stairs, I heard another louder thump. I thought this must be my cat getting excited it was finally food time. Well, when I opened the door, she was nowhere to be found. Really unusual for her, so I was confused. I walked into the kitchen to look for her, when I noticed something that made my heart immediately sink. The furnace door was closed. I never close that furnace door, and neither do my parents either. We want the cat to be able to get inside and catch all the mice that live there. I recognized then that the thunk I'd heard must have been the heavy furnace door opening and closing. I was completely frozen. I was convinced there must be someone right behind that door hiding from me. Now, I'd seen a lot of scary movies lately. It could have been paranoia, I guess, but this felt awful, and I knew something was not right. I knew I didn't want to give this potential person any reason to open this door. I put on my very best acting skills and pretended I'd not noticed anything amiss. I did some baby talk to my cat, who still had not materialized, and scooped out some food for her. I felt super weirded out when I had to let the door out of my sight. I was basically keeping it in my vision at all times to see any movement. After feeding my cat, I went back upstairs. I grabbed my mom immediately and explained what had just happened. She was skeptical, of course, again, scary movies and me already being paranoid. She tried to brush it off as maybe one of the contractors just having closed the door, but seeing how off-put I was, she went to go wake up my dad. My dad grabbed his gun and went downstairs. He screamed up at us suddenly to call the cops and get somewhere safe. We hid in the bedroom and called the cops, who showed up and searched the entire house, not finding anyone. My dad explained to me after they'd gone through everything why he'd said to call the cops. He saw the furnace room door and the back door to the outside were both wide open. I, 22 and female, worked at a mall when I was a young adult. Oftentimes, it would be dark by the time I got to the bus stop. There were lots of druggies and creeps around as well. They did bother me some, but they mostly stayed away for the most part. One night, I was walking extra late because of never leaving customers behind. I saw a truck nearby. It was talking to a girl I assumed was in her teens, as she looked to be quite young. At first, I didn't think too much of it. A lot of teens had to be picked up from the mall, as they worked in the food court and sometimes on weekends got late night shifts. I honestly thought it must be her dad picking her up. I really did. As I got closer, though, I could see she was very upset. Maybe they had a fight or something. The guy looked up a little angrily at me as I sat down. I could hear him saying something to the girl.
"Come on, honey, come with me now. Your mom is worried."
The girl backed up slowly at this. That's when I fully looked up. I could see she was looking at me with this terrified face. This man was clearly drinking heavily, as he smelled of liquor, but not stumbling around. My stomach sank. The bus wasn't going to be there for half an hour. I was a small 5-foot woman myself. Immediately, I started to have a suspicion that this guy was not her father.
"Come on, honey, get in the truck. Get in the truck. It's too late for you to be out."
I didn't know whether this man was her father or not, but I decided it was better to err on the safe side just in case. I walked over to the girl and called out to her. "Hey, wow, I haven't seen you around here in a long time." I started chatting with her, and she sat down next to me, ignoring the man. He was visibly angry at this point and went to the truck. I thought this would be to leave. The girl sat down next to me and explained that man was not her father. She had no idea who he was. He had just randomly pulled up alongside her and was now trying to get her to go with him. I told her to just act natural and keep refusing. I had her back. The guy came back to us with his phone up to his ear and a pipe from his trunk as well.
"Okay, bitch, get in the truck already. Your mom's pissed off. Lady, you need to mind your own business. We're a parent and child."
I told him he clearly was not her father. He had to leave before security cameras captured him doing something illegal. I could just see a look pass over his face, as if he'd just realized those cameras existed, but decided he'd already gone too far. He started to walk towards us. He viciously grabbed the girl by her arm and started to drag her away as she struggled. I tried to push him off of her, but he told me not to get between a father and daughter or I'd regret it. I saw a security guard in the window, luckily. He mouthed to me, "Are you okay?" I mouthed back that I was not, and shook my head. The man started to unlock the door and grabbed his phone to call the police. The moment this father saw this guy coming, he finally decided to leave, swearing angrily at us and jumping in his truck and speeding off. The girl was visibly shaken and crying. Her real parents came not too long after that incident. I left with a few words to the police about my side and gave them my number as well. I'm glad I was there because I've not seen that guy ever since. I don't know what might have happened to that young girl if I hadn't been. I learned she was only 15 years old. At one point, the man even tried to convince me that I was also his daughter. I guess he really thought that approach would work for him. My friend and I are still trying to process exactly what we just saw the other day. We've talked it through countless times, trying to figure out logically how any of this was possible. Hopefully, someone on here can give us some thoughts and ideas as to what actually happened that night. So I recently purchased a small bass boat, and my first mate Legov and I have been super eager to explore the lake and its islands. We also wanted to learn the fishing around it too. We're new to Tennessee, you see. Yesterday, on the 4th of July, we decided to go fishing in this very secluded part of the lake. We'd named this area No Man's Land because of the low-hanging bridge that prevented boaters from entering the section. My boat could just make it underneath because of how small it was, but I'd never seen another boat in there. We decided to go deeper into the cove than we'd ever been before. As we're slowly trolling down the lake, the path before us splits into 3 forks. I ask which one we should take. Legov immediately says the middle one, so we continued straight ahead as the water changed from a large lake to a narrow river-like path. This is where a chain of events happened in quick succession. We've talked it through after the fact to try and recall the order of how this all went down. The first thing that happened was we heard this weird vocal noise coming from the woods just beyond the shoreline. We both tensed up and felt immediately uneasy. "What was that?" Legov asked. "A dog, I think," I said. That was the first thing that came to mind from that sound. Legov didn't think that was a dog, though. We could see birds high above us perching on a branch and staring at us. Maybe it was a bird calling out or something. I'm not sure when it got into my hand, but at some point I drew my pistol and held it down at my side. Legov held the fishing bow. We both had a very weird feeling as we drifted down the river, eyes glued to the bank. We grew closer to a rotting pine tree that had fallen and was now half submerged in the water, sitting on the shoreline. That's when it happened. We heard a loud, very heavy-footed animal running through the woods and getting closer to the water. At first, I thought it must be a deer. But as it got closer and closer to the water, we realized it was too big to be a deer. What emerged from the tree line was a very large jet-black canine. My brain immediately thought, oh, it must be a coyote. But this was much bigger, at least the size of a very huge German shepherd. It was fast, too, almost like a black shadow, switching through the trees and quickly approaching the bank we were floating across from. We couldn't really make it out very well. It was very black and almost seemed kind of blurry. We couldn't quite see the fur, its face, or its eyes, just the outline of its body and tall wolf-like ears on its head. It was obviously a canine, though. Adrenaline started rushing through us, and my brain raced, thinking we were about to have to defend ourselves from a large animal. It almost looked as if it were charging straight at us, but it was zigzagging and dodging through the trees toward the exact portion of the shoreline we were floating past. We were scared, but the 15 feet of water between our boat and the shoreline gave us some confidence. It would have had to swim out to reach us, and I didn't find that very likely. It continued its leaping through the woods and quickly reached our portion of the shoreline. In one majestic fluid motion, it leapt and dove into the water right under the half-submerged pine tree in front of us. That was it. We held our breath as we waited to hear it swimming or moving towards us. Small ripples reached our boat from the splash area. "Watch for it to come back up," I whispered. I had never heard of canines being able to submerge themselves underwater, but here it was happening right in front of our eyes. We waited, but nothing. Silence. Just the subtle sound of the ripples it made slowly dissipating away. We waited for 20 more seconds, but still nothing. It was almost as if the entire forest had just shut off. Silence. Our eyes were glued to that fallen pine tree. "Maybe it's hiding behind or in the water under the tree," Legov suggested. We got the courage to troll the boat a bit closer to inspect the tree, but there was nothing. No sign anything had ever been there. At this point, we were both in complete shock, stunned. It was gone. How could that be so? How could something that big just vanish, especially such a huge creature? After 30 more seconds of silence, Legov finally broke it. You just saw that, right?" A shiver flashed down my spine. "All of it," I replied. "Really though, what the fuck was that?" We both nervously laughed to each other. We stayed floating near the shoreline in shock for at least another 10 minutes, hoping for a sign we weren't going crazy. Legov scoured the waters, looking to see if that creature would come back up for air, but it never did. How could a big black wolf like that just disappear into thin air, or water for that matter? Being skeptics, there must be a logical explanation as to what we saw, but I can't really think of one. If it had just splashed into the water and gotten out again, wouldn't we have seen it walk away in whatever direction since it was so big? We also would have heard it as well, putting weight on the leaves and branches and making loud noises, but there was just silence, the loudest of silences. I suppose perhaps it drowned or something, but I really can't say. We live right in the middle of Tennessee if that helps at all. We're still both a little bit shaken up by this. This is 100% true and we're not bullshitting you. Any insight would be much appreciated. So this happened around Christmas time a few years ago. I had taken my 5-year-old niece to the mall to get her picture taken with Santa. While we were there waiting in line, I noticed this little old man and lady sitting on a bench, watching all the kids waiting to see Santa. The old man came right up to us and told my niece that she looked very cute. I told him thank you, and he went right back down to sit on the bench next to his wife. We got the picture taken, and were waiting a while for the picture to be printed. I asked the photographer why our picture hadn't been printed since it had been such a long time. He told me that my mother had already taken it and pointed at that little old lady who had been watching us in the line before. I went after the old man and presumably his wife and demanded they give me the picture back. The old man seemed embarrassed and told me his wife had grabbed our picture by accident. She said she had meant to take their granddaughter's picture instead. He very swiftly apologized, but I still had a weird feeling in my gut that something was not quite right about these two. Next, I took my niece to the merry-go-round, and like magic, the old people appeared there too, still without any kids alongside them. The lady waved at my niece and smiled this big, toothless smile at us. At this point, I had decided it was best if we now left the mall. I took my niece to get lunch at her favorite restaurant that was almost all the way across town from that mall we had been at. Because of this, I felt much more relaxed as we had lunch, completely forgetting about those weird old people from before. As we were driving home, though, my niece spotted this playground that was close to a different, much smaller mall. She begged and begged me to stop at the playground and play. I could see there was already a young man there with his little boy on the swings, so we weren't alone. Another car pulled into the parking lot shortly after we got there. We played for a little while, when I noticed that no one had gotten out of that car yet. I looked over at the driver's side of the car, and sure enough, it was those exact same old people. They had followed us from the mall, to the restaurant, and then to this playground. The old man was now staring straight at me and my niece, almost like he was hunting us. I noticed that he had his arm down and was moving it up and down as well. It clicked that he was masturbating in his car. I didn't want to scare my niece, so I subtly alerted the young man who was also there with his son. I got my niece into the car quickly and drove into this mall's parking lot. I then called the cops and the mall security. I didn't want to stick around long enough for my niece to see this man getting arrested, so instead I gave the cops my number and left to my dad's work. I figured there we would be safe, just in case those old people decided to follow us again. The cops called me back a few hours later and told me that by the time they'd gotten out there, the couple was already long gone. They were looking for the description of the car I'd given them, though. It makes me physically sick every time I think about the fact that these old people are out and about and seem totally harmless when they're actually pervert sex offenders, or even worse, possibly kidnappers. This occurred many years ago, but it will forever stay with me and change my views on allowing my kids to ever have their own separate phone line. It was a few weeks after Christmas, and my parents had got me my own personal phone, with my own separate phone line as well. That was the cool thing back then, way before cell phones were big. I had given my friends the number, because who wouldn't do that, right? Anyway, it was about 3 a.m. or so. I had been deep asleep when my phone suddenly began to ring. I thought to myself, that's odd, who could be calling me this early? We all have to be up for school in the morning. I answered it, thinking it would be one of my friends, but all I could hear was deep breathing on the other end. I laughed it off as someone just messing around with me, and I hung up the phone. I tried to return to sleep, but as soon as I started, the phone rang again. This time I actually answered it. Who is this? Nothing, just deep breathing again. At this point, I was beginning to get very irritated. I told this person to stop calling me from then on, and hung up once again. I laid down again for about 30 minutes, when my phone rang once more for the third time that morning. I was so mad, and sleepy as well. I screamed out into the phone. This isn't funny, I'm trying to sleep. I have school in the morning, so stop calling me. This time, there was a reply though. It was a man's voice, very gravelly. He laughed at me. I can see you. You're very pretty. Why don't you come out and play in the snow with me? With that, I hung up and started crying. I ran to my parents' room and woke up my mom, telling her what had happened. She woke up my dad and made me tell him everything. Now, they were both up together. My dad went into my room and checked the windows and everything. He made sure all the locks on the doors were locked as well, and proceeded to tell me it must just be someone playing a sick joke. Everything would be fine. He told me to just unplug my phone from the outlet. Finally, I managed to go back to sleep until my mom woke me up for school. I got up and started getting ready. I opened my blinds to my window that led to the backyard when I noticed on this very frosty morning that there were handprints all over my window. I called my parents in there, totally freaked out obviously. My dad immediately called the police. The police came out to take a report and look at the evidence. They decided to go into the backyard to check as well. Sure enough, there were a fresh set of footprints in the snow that led right up to my window. They had gone from the front of the house to the back to my window, back to the back door, and back to the front door. The police think the guy had tried to get into the house that night. Before I tell you this story, let me give you some background information. This happened a few years ago, when I was 13 years old. I live in a small town, and near my house, about 3 blocks down the road, there's a large network of fields and woods, where lots of people go walking. I usually walk through the woods and across 3 fields to get home from school. It was winter, and obviously in the winter it gets dark very early. I was late back from school that day. I had detention for back-chatting the teacher in my math class. Anyway, I guess that's beside the point. The point is, I left school and it was already getting quite dark. The school I go to was about 1.5 miles away from those fields. Now, at the time, no one was around in those fields because it was so dark. It was late and honestly very creepy in my opinion. I suddenly had this feeling, like in my subconscious. It was in the back of my mind in a way, and it was urging me not to go that way no matter what for some reason. Now, I've always been a very paranoid person. At first, I did consider this, but it was quicker to get home if I walked through the fields and trees. Yeah, it would save me a good 40 minutes of walking along the pavement. I got through the first 2 fields, then there was the woods. It was very dark. Darker than the fields, obviously. I'm not ashamed to admit that I was quite afraid in that moment. I'm still scared of the dark. I figured, hey, I'll just walk fast, then the dark of those trees will be behind me, and I won't have to do this ever again. I made my way into those trees walking very fast. That's when things got scary though. At first, I heard breathing behind me. I thought it was just from me walking fast, as I'm not the most sporty of people in the best of times, and I had just walked 2.5 miles. I thought not much of it until I heard a stick snap behind me. I knew I hadn't snapped it because it was from further behind me, not from under me. I was internally freaking out at this point. First the breathing, then a twig snapping, then footsteps, very distinct footsteps. They were much heavier than my own, and they seemed to be trying to keep pace with me but failing. I'm guessing that's what the guy was trying to do, exactly match my footsteps. Well, that had failed. I took off into a run. Then it was obvious if it hadn't been before that I was being followed. I heard a man's voice call out from behind me.
"Hey, kid!"
The only way I can describe what I felt in that moment is that my entire body went cold. I don't even understand why it did, but I felt a fear for my life. I feared for my life because I was now being chased. I was super tired from walking so far, and I knew I couldn't keep this up much longer. I took a glance back. The man who was chasing me, from what I could see in my brief glances, looked to be in his 40s. He was wearing a white, torn, dirty t-shirt and ripped shorts. I think he also had sandals on. As soon as I got to the edge of the trees, I did not stop running. That guy chased me all the way up until the edge of the train bridge that I had to walk over before he disappeared back into the trees. At this point, I was in tears, shaking and choking because I was so exhausted. I walked slowly after that, regaining my breath best I could. The road I had to walk along connected to a grassy hill with a stream, a path, and trees on either side. As I looked down, that guy that had chased me was standing by the small wooden bridge next to the stream, staring at me. I could tell he was grinning, even from how far away I was. There was something in his hand. I had seen it while he was running after me. It was silver and glinted slightly. I think it was a switchblade. The way his face contorted, it gives me chills to even think about it, let alone write it down. I eventually got home and ran to my mother in tears. I was barely able to tell her what had happened. I said enough though, and she called the cops. They searched the woods, and in the end they found nothing. I never saw that guy again, at least until about a month later, when I was walking to school with my friend. I went the long way now. There was no way I was ever going to walk through those woods again. As I was walking though, I saw that guy. He was on the other side of the street wearing old clothes, and his hair was dirty as hell. I just kept my head down in fear of being recognized. My friend asked me what the hell I was doing. I didn't tell her anything though. I just said I was afraid of people with greasy hair having nits, and she laughed. No need to scare her with my experiences with that guy. If this has taught me anything though, it's to not walk alone in the woods in the dark if you can help it. There's so many places people can just hide in plain sight, especially if it's dark out. You don't want to be caught alone like I was. I've recently moved to a new area due to my work, and it's quite far away from my family and friends. It's this weird kind of cul-de-sac area. I'm currently working on finding some new friends here, but I work Monday through Friday and visit my parents on the weekend, so needless to say it's a very hectic schedule. I start at 7 a.m. and finish around 6:30 or 7 at night. You can imagine that when I get home, I just want to eat and go to sleep right away. One day I came home and there was an old couple standing outside my door. They introduced themselves as the couple that lived directly opposite my house. They even handed me some home-cooked dinner. I said thank you and mentioned that I would invite them in. There were still a lot of boxes everywhere, and I was quite embarrassed that they had to see this. I told them I'd recently moved to this new city on my own for work. We small-talked for a few more seconds, and soon I was inside my house. I honestly put that food they had given me in the fridge and thought I'd just head straight to bed. In the morning, I saw the food that they had given me half-eaten and now stored in the sink. Must have been way too tired last night to remember eating this. The next night, I'm coming home from work when I see the old lady waving at me from her kitchen window. I vaguely waved back and headed inside. Nothing else happened that night. The next night, though, I had the shittiest day I'd ever had at work. I had to stay behind to work a half hour over due to an unhappy customer, and I'd been craving my bed all day long. I pulled up outside my house, only to see the old couple now standing outside as well. Are they keeping a record of what times I come home? I quickly asked myself. I was honestly not in the mood for creepy-ass neighbors and making small talk again. I didn't know these people, and I didn't know or understand why they were trying to socialize with me. Plus, with the day I've had, I was not in the best of moods. I braced myself for whatever lame conversation I was about to have. Getting out of my car, I just waved in their direction and started fumbling in my purse to find the keys to my front door. "Excuse me, miss, would you like to come over for some dinner? You look really tired." The old lady called out to me. I vaguely said something about me being too tired while generally getting really annoyed. They just wouldn't let up, though. I opened my door and was just about to step in. The old guy rushed across the road and even placed his hand on my arm. He looked me dead in my eyes and said something cheery like, "My wife makes the best pie, you know." Okay, whatever. I thought I'd go over for a cup of tea and some pie and maybe try and nicely explain to them that I'd had a shit day and I just really needed to head home. Hopefully, they would take the hint. After shutting the door and stepping into their house, though, the old guy slammed the door shut and locked it behind him. They both proceeded to tell me that around 7:30, they had been looking out the windows for me by chance, to give me some chicken stir-fry they had cooked up and saved for me that night since I'd been so tired lately. They had both clearly seen a man standing in my bedroom window, walking downstairs. They could even see him in the living room window walking through the kitchen. When they'd seen my car pull into the cul-de-sac, they saw him rush back past the living room window and obviously up the stairs to hide. They called the police, and they'd tried to stop me from entering my house. Whoever this was, they were clearly still upstairs now hiding for me. My heart fell. I felt dizzy. I glanced to my bedroom window, expecting to see someone there, but nothing was there. Just the curtains, left wide open. The police turned up shortly thereafter. I had to wait outside while they searched the home. In the crawl space right outside my bedroom door, they found a homeless man curled up. He'd been living there for the last 2-ish weeks. According to him, he had snuck in when the moving packers had left the door open, while struggling to move something in. He had been in the house watching me while I had been asleep, and would come out while I was at work and away for the weekends. So here's a bit of backstory first. I live in a neighborhood with lots of abandoned houses. There's about 12 houses in my neighborhood, and over 7 of them are abandoned. In one of those abandoned houses, there's a playground in the backyard that some of the old neighbors left behind. Now, I was 12 at the time, and I knew in my brain I was a little bit too old to be playing on a playground made for 6-year-olds. But what can I say? I just couldn't resist a nice swing set. I would spend some of my extra time over there. It was summer, and I usually would just play video games. The house was just past some woods you had to walk through, about a block away from my own house. It was a normal day out. My mother said I should go get some fresh air outside, and that she was tired of watching me just sit there and play video games. Well, little me thought it was the perfect opportunity to go and swing on that swing set. It was beautiful outside, not too hot heat, but warm enough with a slight wind. So I slipped my shoes on and walked down to the forest. As I was just about to take maybe a few steps in, I heard a branch snap behind me. Now, I hear these all the time from squirrels bustling about, so I really didn't think that much of it. I finally finished walking through the forest and reached that old house. I opened the back fence, lock it, and start to swing myself. I had swung for about 2 minutes or so when I began to hear breathing. I stopped for a moment, trying to think of where the hell that could possibly be coming from. After about 30 seconds of stopping, I forced myself to think it was just me, as I was going pretty high. I continued to swing for another 5 minutes when I decided that I was done for now. As soon as I sat up, though, I heard a, "Hey!" I looked around for a moment, only to notice a man about mid-30s or early 40s, dirty, gross black hair that was all over the place, a stained-up sweatshirt, and underwear with the back cut out so I could see the outline of his butt. This guy was obviously homeless and had a crazy look in his eyes. Here I am, a 5'2", 95-pound kid with no strength at all, staring down this 6'2", 170-pound man. As tough as I could, I deepened my voice and said, "What's up?" The guy stared at me and started to smile. After 15 seconds, which seemed like 40 minutes, he said, "You have room for one more?" I quickly said that I was actually leaving, but the swing was all his now. The man opened the gate, walked past me, sat down, and started to swing. I sped walked to the gate and slammed it shut. I started walking into the forest. About 20 seconds later, I heard a loud,
"Get the fuck back here!"
I heard the gate spin open, and I could hear him sprinting not far behind me. I practically shat my pants. I started running as fast as my little legs could carry me. I somehow made it back to my house and locked the door without the man noticing where I'd gone. I told my mom practically in tears, and she called the police. The police searched around and came back a couple of hours later with no one. That night I was tossing and turning in my bed when I began to hear footsteps out in my street. I looked out the window, only to see that man peeking through the windows of every single house along my street. I started to shake as I grabbed the phone and called the police without even telling my parents. The cops showed up a few minutes later and caught the man. They didn't give us a whole lot of information, but a few days later the cops called. They told us the man had a mental illness and had been living in one of the abandoned houses for a couple of weeks now. He was planning on kidnapping me and doing God knows what. My dad, younger brother, he was 7 at the time, and me, I was 14, went to the bush to camp. I live in Australia, and if you look up a place called One Tree Hill, I was a few miles/kilometers out from there. We drove for a while until we found a clearing. On the other side of this clearing was a dirt road that dipped down, then went uphill again. We set up camp on the edge of that clearing, with our backs turned to the dirt road. We spent the whole day hiking around the area, and even ran into a small family on the way back. It felt like a really safe area to be in because of this. Eventually, it was getting quite late in the afternoon though, so my dad started roaring up a fire. We roasted marshmallows and drank Coke, telling silly stories until about 8 p.m. At that point, I told my dad I was going to get a little bit of shut-eye. I go into the tent, and my little brother decided to sleep in my tent as well. After a little while, though, I realized I couldn't get to sleep for some reason. I decided to go back outside. My brother woke up and begged me not to go, but I insisted I just needed some fresh air and I'd be back in a minute. I went and sat a few meters from camp, looking at that dirt road, thinking about all the things we were doing tomorrow. The dirt road had pretty much all the moonlight hitting it that night. As soon as I noticed that, on the right side of the dirt path, I could see a shadow so tall and skinny coming right for where we were. Our big fire was still burning strong, and my dad and brother were fast asleep. I didn't think too much of it at first, maybe just another family approaching or something. I rested against a tree and sat there for a moment. I looked down at the path again. The shadow was still there, but now there was a person connected to it. All I could see was a silhouette from the distance between them and I. Then, the next thing the figure did sent an icy chill all over me. They started to dance. They were dancing like the best song they'd ever heard just came on, only it looked horrible because of how tall and slender they were. They began to dance closer and closer to the campsite. I was frozen with fear. All I could do was silently cry. This person danced all the way up to the fire and started warming their hands on it. They hadn't seen me yet, as I wasn't in the camp itself. I could see him better now with the light of the fire against him. He had dark, broken leather shoes, pants that were way too short for him exposing his ankles, a long brown coat, and a cowboy hat. He was even still dancing while warming his hands. He flashed a glance at the tent my brother was in, then stood in front of it for what seemed like an hour. just watching, waiting. I decided this was the time to go and wake up my dad. I very quietly did a circle around the camp until I was next to my dad's tent. I unzipped it slowly and stepped inside. Little did I know, around the same time that mysterious man had entered my tent as well. I shook my dad awake and told him there was a strange man in our camp watching our tents. My dad perked up so fast, he threw me his cell phone to call the police. He got out this long wooden stick, which we'd used to cook the marshmallows with, and walked over to my tent. "Hey, you fucking bastard! I know you're in there!" screamed my dad. The man suddenly let out a shrill scream and came bursting out of the tent. He took off sprinting down the dirt path. I was on the phone with the police in that area already. They had heard everything in the background and told me help was on the way immediately. 2 cop cars pulled up and assessed the situation, then escorted us back onto the highway. We all went home at 1 a.m. in the morning. We never went back camping in that area. I was told they commenced a search during daylight hours. One officer only found the hat he was wearing, perched high up on a tree branch. I also just quickly wanted to share my brother's perspective of the situation as well. This was his words. "I was waiting for you to wake up because I was scared. I saw the tent open. It didn't look like you, but it was so dark I couldn't really tell. I asked for your name, and I remember he said in such a grisly voice, 'Nice to meet you. My name is Howard.' He then tipped his hat and began to touch my ankle. That's when Dad intervened. Ever since that night, my brother has an extreme trauma anytime he sees a cowboy hat, and he absolutely cannot speak to people named Howard. We've all not been camping since." This is a lengthy story, but I didn't think I could really leave out any details. That's my apology ahead of time. This story takes place over a period of time while I worked as a cashier at an Asian fast food restaurant during high school. I was one of our best workers and always very friendly to the customers. Therefore, I basically had to work all the time. On one of our slower days, a man came into the restaurant when it was only one of my managers and I working the floor together. This man had quite the impressive beer belly, a set of teeth which would make any dentist cringe, and ice blue, bloodshot eyes. He explained he had never eaten there before and was just passing through for a few days. He was a truck driver apparently, and waiting on a shipment or something. Being the customer-friendly gal I am, I gave him some suggestions and made some small talk, like I do with all of our customers. Well, this man decided to take the small talk to a completely new level. He began to openly talk about his drug abuse and how the trucking company gave up drug testing him because he would constantly fail. Okay, how nice. Being reasonably freaked out now, I eventually got him away from the cash register to sit down at a table. I usually stayed behind the register and busied myself, but because we weren't busy, I served all the food and cleaned all the tables. Therefore, it was easy for him to keep making conversation with me. He kept on asking me these random questions about places he could visit to pass his time, or whatever topic he could come up with on the spot. Along with that, he prolonged his visit there by constantly ordering cups upon cups of our wonton soup. Arguably, it is some pretty good soup, but I'm positive it was because he wanted an excuse to stay and talk with me. Once he finally left, my manager and I joked about how strange that all was, and then we went on with our night as usual. On the following day, we were extremely busy during lunch hour. I was working on overdrive, trying to get through this long line of people. I was completely preoccupied when lo and behold my drug addict trucker friend comes up to my register. He told me how much he'd enjoyed the food the previous day, and also how much he enjoyed my company specifically. Major red flag. Before he left to find a seat, he told me he'd definitely be back up at the register again to talk to me and order some more wonton soup. Great. Needless to say, I avoided the shit out of him the entire time he was there, even though he kept trying to speak to me whenever I passed and was constantly looking around the restaurant for me. I stayed the hell away from this guy. A little bit later, my intimidating badass manager and I were at the cash register, doing our own thing, when I couldn't help but constantly notice this man looking at our entrance. All of a sudden, he left in a hurry. When he returned, I asked him what that was all about. He proceeded to tell me my good pal kept entering in and out of the restaurant, pacing outside our windows and staring at me. He had left to tell him to fuck off. At this point, I was so scared I couldn't even contain myself. Shaken up, I completed my night at the restaurant. I was reassured when I remembered it was his last day in town. He apparently lived in New York, which was pretty damn far away from the Midwest where I live. I truly believe this would be my last ever encounter with this creep. Months passed by, and I had put the incident to the back of my mind, when all of a sudden you-know-who walks up to the door higher than a kite. My stomach dropped and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up immediately. He walked right up to the register and immediately confronted me. I was literally pissing myself at this point. I asked what he would like to order. He ignored my question and kept on repeating to me, "You don't remember me?" over and over again. I thought it would be best to not play into whatever fantasies he had. I said I did not. I tried again to ask what he would like to order. He told me a cup of wonton soup, and he'd be back to order more. All the while, in between every breath, he would mutter, "You really don't remember me?" It was obvious he was high on something. I ignored him and verbally pushed him to sit down. Before he left, though, he looked at me with this yellow, crooked smile. "I'll see you soon." All the people I was working with that night were pretty big guys who were very protective of me, so I did feel a little bit safer. On the inside, I was still in shock, though. I told my one coworker the entire story. He said he would walk me to my car after closing. Oddly enough, the man left pretty much without saying a single word to me his entire visit, which did not sit well with me at all. When 9 p.m. hit and I was done with work, my coworker held up his promise and walked me out to my car. As we were walking, we suddenly heard an angry voice muttering closely behind us, along with steps gaining speed. In no time at all, my coworker turned around and pulled out his pocket knife. He waved it for the man to see in the dark and screamed at him to fuck off or else he'd slit his throat. All of a sudden the man freaked out, turned around and sprinted in the opposite direction. My coworker continued to walk me to my car and calm me down seeing how shaken up I was. I drove home completely paranoid and hysterical. I was in utter amazement of what could have happened to me right then and there. For other reasons, I quit my job not long after, and I've never since seen that disgusting man again. To this day, though, I can't help but feel uneasy whenever I pass by a truck. To this creeper's delight, I'm sure. I will, in fact, never forget him. So this happened earlier this month. I'm not sure how much danger I was actually in, but it definitely creeped the absolute shit out of me. Give it a read and see if it creeps you out as well. I was working a job out of town that had put me up in this hotel. The hotel was nice and all, but because of some snafu, the rest of the crew was staying in one on the other side of town. This, needless to say, made after-work beers much less convenient. The fact that this hotel was almost completely vacant except for me as well just added to the weird factor. Anyway, about 3 days into this gig, I was too tired to meet up with everyone else that night. I was not too tired to go drink a beer in the hotel hot tub though, which I proceeded to do by myself, like some sort of lonely, wet alcoholic, I guess. I'm feeling pretty good and slightly buzzed after a relaxing soak. I was drying off when I began to hear this strange sound. It was very hard to describe, kind of like a bulldog struggling to breathe or something, very animal-esque. Since the hot tub area was outside, I started looking around, expecting to see a wounded raccoon or something. To my surprise, though, the source of that noise came rounding the corner. It was a man, shirtless, shoeless, a super jacked dude with long hair and these crazy eyes. The kind of eyes that are vacant and say I'm out of my mind on something or both. He was snapping at the air like a dog, making these strange animal sounds. Now, I'm also a dude, and while I'm not the most pacifist guy ever or anything, I'm also not a fan of just getting into fights with crazy people after getting half a buzz in a hot tub on a work night. I started to discreetly put all my shit back on, trying not to acknowledge this weirdo or make any eye contact. I exited on the opposite side of the caged-off pool area. As I'm exiting, I sneak a quick glance at my new friend here, only to see him pulling a harmonica out of his pocket. I heard him begin to mournfully play it as I was walking away. Then it got even weirder though. I turned a corner and had to walk along one side of the building and across a courtyard. Then I had to turn another corner to get to the elevator that would take me to the far-off safety of my room. As I'm going along, I hear this harmonica song getting louder and louder. I'm looking around again, expecting to see him behind me, but I can't see him anywhere. The music keeps getting louder though. My head is on a damn swivel. As I finally get to the elevator, I slam the button, and as soon as the door opens, the music suddenly stops. I think that scared me more than anything. I turned around, ready to see the man jump at me, but there was nothing there. I backed into the elevator and punched the button for my floor, like it had just made fun of my mom or something. I got up to the third deck and just about sprinted to my room. As the door was slamming behind me, I could hear that harmonica music start up again. I sat there with the deadbolt on. I could hear the harmonica on and off, at various levels of volume throughout the night. This happened around 9:30 or so, and the last time I heard it was around 2 a.m., shortly before I fell asleep after staying up in terror. I didn't see the guy again for the rest of my stay. I'm not even sure if I'm overreacting or what, but I still get goosebumps thinking about that wild-eyed dude just patrolling this huge, nearly vacant hotel, playing his little song on the harmonica. A little bit of background. Growing up, I used to go with my mom to work. Sometimes she occasionally couldn't find a babysitter. Usually, it was fun to walk around the store and help with the little things here and there. That being said though, it was in a very bad part of town, in a not-so-good city as well. I grew up around transients, homeless people, drug addicts. In hindsight, it was probably a good thing it let me see they were just normal people in hard times. But it also gave me a bit of a sixth sense for people as well, since robberies would happen while I was in the store before, and other dangerous things like that. My mom would always keep me cooped up in a little office in the back, so I was never really in much danger. One day though, my mom had to go into the store to pick up some check stubs, so I came with her. There was usually this homeless guy named Randy out front. He never really caused any problems though, and the entire store knew him. So they'd let him just sit there to rest on rainy days, like it was that particular day. We walked inside. My mom told me to go wait by the registers and stand there for a little bit. I started leaning on things and playing with the buttons of a broken cash register right next to the exit. I should also say today was an especially dead day at the store, so there was only one check stand open at the other end of the line. As I was pushing those buttons, I suddenly felt a tug on my shirt like someone was behind me. I assumed it must be my mom. I turned around, only to see a middle-aged couple that had deep wrinkles on them. The man of the couple smiled at me.
"Hi there, kiddo. Wondering if you want to buy a puppy, maybe? We have a few in our car. We can go show you one if you want. See if you want to purchase."
I immediately felt really bad vibes from these people. My mom had always told me about people saying things like that growing up, so this put me on high alert right away. I tried to get past them and said something about needing to tell my mom first and ask if I could go with them. As I was trying to walk around though, the man suddenly grabbed me by my arm and started to drag me away to the door. Immediately, I grasped onto the edge of the register and hung on for dear life while screaming for my mom. This old man didn't look like he would be that strong, but compared to the strength of a small kid, it felt like trying to fight against a bear. Eventually, he of course pried me off of the thing. I was ready to turn around and brawl tooth and nail if need be. I was going to make sure that if they took me, at least I would go out with some noise. Just as I turned around, though, Randy was standing right there, staring at us. "Hey, is everything okay?" The woman came in this time and said in a hurried tone, "Oh, yes, he's our son. Come on, Greg." I screamed out, "My name is..." insert name here. Just then, my mom came around the corner. She called out to the guy holding me and rushed over, separating us. Then she said in a deadly serious tone, "Can I ask why you were just holding my son?" And the couple seemed to stop for a moment and think over their options. The woman just said this, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I thought that was our son. Well, we better go look for ours." They rushed right past Randy out the door. I told my mom what happened when they left. She thanked Randy profusely afterward and held my hand every time we went to the store after. In 2003, I had met a guy that said he would take me on some grand adventures and make my life very exciting. Little did I know when I embarked on this adventure that the safe world I had grown up in was about to get shattered. I lived in a small town and had never really traveled outside of my state. I never experienced life in a way that others might. In my town, we were kind of sheltered from the big crime and other things that have been happening over the countryside. My now ex decided to take me on a journey of being an over-the-road trucker. In a lot of cases, this was actually a great experience. There were a lot of fun times, and I got to see quite a lot of the US that I might otherwise not have. But trucking is really hard, and being on the road 24/7 is not an easy lifestyle. Being cooped up in a small truck with someone else for that long will cause anyone to become mad. Life on the road is much different now than it was when I was trucking. We now have a lot of advancements in technology. The ability to binge watch your favorite YouTube channel on demand or surf the web, play games on your phone to keep yourself occupied. But back then, the only forms of entertainment we had were either watching one of the dozen or so DVDs we owned, reading yet another book, or talking over the radio. Often this meant we opted for talking on the radio, and this became our version of social media, long before Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter were even a thought in someone's mind. Just like we do now, we'd create a different identity or persona to hide behind, while interacting with people who were basically strangers. And trust me, though a lot of them can be nice, some truckers can be creepy as fuck. Keeping a bit of anonymity is the only real way to stay safe on the road. When you're a trucker, you acquire a CB handle. My ex's was Ninja Dwarf. Since I was a baby and I'm from Alaska, mine ended up being Northern Exposure. During the time on the road, you meet a lot of crazy people, and you see a ton of crazy shit as well. And I do mean a ton. Oftentimes, though, when you hear those stories about things that can happen on the road, most of them are more gross than scary. You know, drivers getting a little too friendly with their cabin buddy, whether it be a dog, cat, or even a goat. But this time was one of the most terrifying experiences I ever had. And when it comes to strange and unusual events, well, my life is full of them. But this one takes the cake. Have you ever just gotten the heebie-jeebies immediately from hearing someone's voice? Like just flat out scared to talk to someone? A voice that kind of makes you think the person on the other end is not all there. That was this guy. Something about him immediately just made my skin crawl. Even though I'd only ever heard his voice through the crackle of the CB radio. The CB started to crackle, and we heard that distant call. You could barely even hear the voice through the static. Eventually, though, he got close enough that we could hear him clearly. He must have been at least 50 or so miles behind us because it was still really faint. Our CB radio, though, was peaked and tweaked and could really reach out to touch someone. We could just about hear him through the other chatter. I heard it. That voice. It's hard to explain, but I guess the best way I could now describe it would be like Heath Ledger talking as the Joker in the Batman movie. There was just something off about it.
"Hey there, Purple Pete."
The color of our truck.
"Where you headed?"
My ex hollered back we were heading to Arkansas. The driver said he was going the same way and asked if he could tag along with us. He introduced himself as Maniac. We would run from one coast to the other and back again. This guy somehow always seemed to be running the same route as us, but we never actually physically saw his truck. He described it as a 378 long-nosed Peterbilt that was black and had a brow and cattle guard. According to him, he ran dry box from California to Florida, which explained why he always seemed to be either coming or going over the I-10. One week, when we were running from Florida back to LA, we caught up to him on his back trip from Redmond, Washington, to Baton Rouge, Louisiana. He told us he would meet up with us in Nevada when we did our trip back. By that time, we would have run out of hours and needed to take a rest. We said sure, even though I really didn't want to meet this guy. My ex had become friends with him over the radio though, so we gave him an ETA on when we would be back in the area. We also told him what truck stop we would be at, and told him we would meet up with him for a meal. This was before the idea of having a cell phone for anything other than emergencies, so it wasn't like we could just call him when we were going to be in the area. He agreed to meet at that time, and we parted ways. My ex continued talking to him until the radios could no longer reach each other. We had just finished our load and were heading back to Las Vegas to the truck stop we agreed on, and we waited there. Las Vegas is kind of a shady place for truckers in general. Lots of crime and bad things happen, so we decided to wait in the truck. Finally though, after a long while, we got pretty bored. We ventured into the stop for a bit to look around. We waited, and waited, and waited, and eventually we killed enough time where we could take another load. We headed out, never actually meeting up with him in Nevada. A few months later though, we ran into him again in Oklahoma. Around that time, we had heard some chatter on the radio about these lot lizards, slang for truck stop hookers, getting brutally murdered at truck stops in Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Tennessee. We just chalked it up to drama on the radio, though. After all we truckers had quite literally nothing better to do than make up truck driver stories. We had kept hearing about this one, though, and even brought it up to Maniac. He just laughed and said, "Must be one real sick fuck doing it. It must be a story, because if it was true, they would have caught him already. I bet he even left fingerprints or semen at the crime scene or something. With it bloody and messy as it was, I bet he wants to get caught." It seemed like such a weird thing to say, but he was a weird guy, so that was totally in character for him. Maniac went on his way, and we went on ours for a while. After a while, I forgot all about that weird comment. Fast forward to a few weeks later. We were in Mississippi when we heard the familiar voice on the radio. It was Maniac. We had taken a long weekend because it was Labor Day. Most companies were okay with drivers taking an extra day off. Our plan was to make it to this lake out in the middle of nowhere. We were going to drop our trailer and head out bobtail. We chatted, and he said he was going over to Tennessee. He would be heading out the next morning. Cutting our much-needed break short and bypassing the weekend at the lake, my ex decided to run with him so that there would at least be someone to talk to. We had gotten into an argument earlier, and I wasn't talking to him at the time. He absolutely hated the silent treatment. Our load this time was to deliver in North Carolina in a few days, so being a few hours ahead of the deadline just meant we would be at the top of the line to pick our load back. Win-win situation. We left that morning and headed out. The guys decided we would stop in Tennessee, and finally, after 6 months of chatting and planning, meet up with each other. Now, we weren't afraid to meet up with him or anything like that. I was very on edge, though. I was no slouch. I grew up with 15 boys in the house and was a known fighter. My ex was a bigger dude, standing 6'3" and about 280 pounds. In theory, the two of us could easily take him if need be. The only way he would get the best of us was if he had a weapon, which back then was highly illegal to have in trucks. If you were caught by DOT, it was jail time, no questions asked. With our company, we had very specific fuel stations we could use to top off. Maniac was an owner-operator, so he could go anywhere. Maniac said he'd already stopped to get fuel, and took a shower as well. He would drop his trailer and meet us at Flying J, a petrol station that was just down the road from where he was. We get ready to fuel up, shower, and get a booth at the restaurant. We waited about 45 minutes before ordering food, and waited and waited. No one ever showed up, and there was no way to contact him either. My ex was not a patient man. We ate and then headed back to our truck. I remember it being very dark and humid. It was probably 10 p.m. or so at the time. There wasn't much noise in this truck stop, which was unnerving. A quiet truck stop is a dangerous truck stop. We walked across the fuel island to be greeted by a shit ton of flashing lights. It wasn't uncommon for either lizards to get busted or drivers to get involved in shit they're not supposed to, so we didn't think much of it at first. Cops and a truck stop kinda go hand in hand. This was more than just your typical truck stop shenanigans, though. We passed 12 trucks or so. This was one of the bigger Flying J's, so it could probably fit about 80 if you went all the way back to the dirt. I'm a curvy girl, not fat, but I don't look like I belong in a truck stop, you know. I was used to drivers looking at me all creepy-like. I always got taunted and harassed even though I was a driver as well. In fact, there were some truck stops that were not even safe to walk alone in. I was walking with my ex in that moment, and we weren't holding hands or anything, but I was obviously with him. We walked down the row and saw a bobtail truck parked in a full parking spot. I thought it was weird he was in that truck space with no trailer. Typically, they'd park at the end of a run and leave the big spaces for trucks with trailers. Again, that was another unspoken truck driver rule. We moved by this truck. It was dark, I think maybe dark black or blue, with a cattle guard and a brow. I don't remember seeing what type it was, just that it was kind of menacing in the dark. Old school trucker code was if you were looking for company, the driver would park and leave his reading red light on to tell lot lizards that the driver was looking for entertainment. The guy was sitting in the passenger seat. He had the red reading light on, so I could see his face. It was a little bit distorted, but he gave me the creepiest smile, then quickly shut his blinds. We were about 6 trucks down now. I could see his truck from ours. I remember looking back and seeing that red light still illuminating the porthole window in the passenger door. A small slit down the curtain showed a dark spot. He was obviously still watching us. Even as warm as it was, chills shot up my spine, and I got a very uneasy feeling suddenly. My gut wrenched with a feeling of dread. We got back to the truck though and turned on the CB for our night entertainment and see if we could radio Maniac to see what his deal was. The chatter was all about the cops and the ambulance fire truck and DOT. All the commotion was basically across from us but 2 rows up. People were saying there was a dead lot lizard, and it was really bad, like gnarly. We even heard one driver trying to explain it, but then he got told to shut the fuck up by a police officer. Being the nosy people we are, my ex and I jumped out of the truck to go investigate. We dodged in and out and managed to wiggle our way up to the scene. You know when you hear the phrase, "some things cannot be unseen"? This was one of them. That lady, what was left of her, had been tied to the trailer and the truck. Then someone pulled the kingpin, that piece that locks the two together, and let down the landing gear. The driver was now sitting in the back of a police car cuffed, his head limp with his forehead on the back of the seat. He was crying big heavy sobs and there was vomit all over his shirt. We could hear them through the closed door. He was wailing that he had nothing to do with this and praying to God to be forgiven for what had been done. It was obvious he had not done his safety check before he left and decided to just pull out of his space. While she was still attached, she got ripped apart, right in half. Without getting too graphic, I can tell you that a normal human body should never look like that. It was like something you might see in the Saw movies. I remember stumbling back and bumping into another driver. He just looked at me, pale, as if he looked like he was going to get sick. I don't do that well with body function, so I moved away from him and started making my way back. I was almost running back now. 0 fucks given that I should have waited for my ex because he had the keys. When I arrived, I tugged on the door, but it wouldn't open. I ran to the truck stop full speed. I was going to get sick, and I would rather not have people see me. I passed the spot where the bobtail truck was parked, only now it was gone. My ex made it to the truck stop looking for me and said he would walk me back so I could get some sleep. Yeah, like I could sleep after seeing all that. He turned on the radio and began to talk to the other drivers. No one had seen anything apparently. There hadn't even been much lizard traffic. The police had been working overtime cleaning up the stops after they had caught the scent of the first few murders. I sat in the bunk and just kind of stared out the windshield at the flashing lights. There was a sudden tap at the door. A police officer said he was getting statements from everyone there, giving us the rundown about safety and numbers and not to go anywhere alone. Needless to say, I was not planning on leaving the truck anytime soon, though. I told him about that creepy guy that had smiled at me and the bobtail truck and the description of it as well. It seemed the officer didn't see the point of me telling him about some creepy guy, but he took down the information anyway. I don't think I slept for days after. I just kept seeing that horrifying image. Flashes kept going through my head. That vivid image of her face, a red rag in her mouth, and the 100-mile-per-hour tape around her wrists, tying her to the headache rack. She had obviously struggled for her life because there were bruises formed on her stomach and face. Mascara was running down her cheeks. It makes my stomach just queasy thinking about it. Didn't seem to faze my ex much, though. He went on like it wasn't anything big or special. After a few weeks, I finally managed to get the image out of my head, or I had at least convinced myself it wasn't real, just a scene from a horror movie. Either way, I was glad for the time being to be relieved of that image. Fast forward to now February, about 3 months after that incident. We were heading down to New Orleans. I was super excited to see the area and hopefully get in to see Mardi Gras. I wanted to visit the cemeteries and see the mausoleums, go into the voodoo shops and such. We had a few extra hours to spend there, so I was really happy when my ex said we could go wandering around. We parked at this little truck stop. It was one that didn't show up on the big Rand McNally maps. We were actually told about it by another driver. It wasn't really more than a hole-in-the-wall mom-and-pop shop with a small dirt lot and a flickering light pole on one end. At least it was within walking distance of the French Quarter, though, which is where I wanted to go.
"Hey there, Purple Pete. What brings you out this way?"
The voice on the CB was so loud, it was like he was really, really close. There were only 2 other trucks in the lot. An old Freightliner hauling a Swift trailer, and a dark green Kenworth that had a cattle car on the back hauling cows. My ex was still a bit miffed about being stood up months ago, and he could really hold a grudge when he wanted. "Maniac, hey man, where the hell you been? Why'd you stand us up there, good buddy?" My ex radioed back.
"Aw man, you know how it is. Cops make me a bit uneasy, and I'd rather not get fucking caught."
"Caught? What do you mean caught?"
Don't worry about it. You just keep an eye on your girl there. I'd really hate for something bad to happen to her, like all those other girls."
He trailed off. We watched the CB key light up again, burying the needle on the radio. It had to be the same stop for the ping to be so high. He was keyed up but kind of breathing into the mic now.
"You know, with all the bad things I've been doing in those truck stops, I like to play with the lizards before I torture them and destroy them. Those nasty sluts. They shouldn't be defiling themselves with the drugs and sex like they do."
It sounded like he was talking through gritted teeth now. His voice was even louder this time. We could hear the rumble of a truck heading down the one-way street that ended in the truck stop.
"Only God and the devil himself can judge me for my sins. I'll continue to rid the world of these diseased ones that plague humanity."
We looked at each other. This was the only time I'd ever seen anything like fear in my ex's eyes. Tears began to well up, and for the first time I was scared, truly scared for my life. A dust cloud came rolling up in the truck stop, and this dark black menacing Peterbilt with a cattle guard and brow came rolling slowly by. The driver keyed up just as he went past the nose of our truck. It was that same creepy guy from the stop months ago. He smiled that same disgusting smile at us as he put the mic right up to his lips.
"Be safe out there, ninja dwarf. Northern exposure."
His CB handle was pinstriped on his driver door. It said Maniac in bright red letters. In April of 2004, we headed back to Alaska because my ex's father had a massive heart attack. We stayed there for a while before heading back onto the road. As far as I know, there were 7 total murders. There could have possibly been more at the end. Who knows how long he had actually been ridding the world of its sins? I don't know if he was even ever caught. I can tell you one thing though. The second time around, I was not making friends with any random person on the road, and I always kept a 6-inch blade on me at all times, just in case I ever ran into another maniac. Okay, so before I start off this story and go into things, I want to ask you guys something. Have you ever been driving down a long, dark road at night and thought to yourself, damn, this would make the perfect place for an ambush, wouldn't it? I'd imagine that for most people, the thought would have never even crossed your mind, really. I mean, sure, you might see a long row with no streetlights or a big industrial complex road, and think to yourself it feels a bit creepy and a little bit empty, and then you just drive right past it, right? Nobody's there anyway. Who would ever want to drive down such an obviously sketchy area like that, when you don't necessarily need to, right? Well, my friends, let me share with you my tale of the creepiest encounter of my life on one such dark, desolate road. This story occurred in late 2018 around the fall, maybe in September or early October, I think. The point is that around this time and in the area I live in, it gets dark really, really early. I'm talking about 5:45 to 6:15 sunsets around these parts. I had been out of high school for a few years at this point, and I was actually taking a gap year to sort of figure out all of my crap. I'd always been that lazy but brilliant kid, so I'd never really had to put any effort into my schooling at all. This meant I never really learned to properly study either. As you can imagine, I was doing pretty horribly into my first forays into college life. Still, I figured with a little bit of personal responsibility, I could still get my 2.0 GPA back on track. I kinda sorta did. Not really, that's a story for another time. More of a comedy of errors, really. To aid in my efforts of trying to better myself as a person, though, and get a little more wise in the ways of the world, I figured it was about time to get myself a job. Yeah, I know, 21 years old, and I still never had a job, and still live with my parents as well. That's what I'm talking about with the whole trying to get my shit together thing. Needless to say, with my lack of experience, qualifications, or any basic skills really, it was kind of a tough ask to find my first job. I applied to every single retail store near me, CVS, Safeway, Walgreens, even the fast food places like KFC and Taco Bell. It seemed that nobody was willing to have a layabout like me at the time. Maybe it's because I was not the best at social interaction, so the interviewing process didn't exactly go very well. Well, as luck would have it, it turned out the exact perfect job for me was just opening up around my town. A job that needed no resume and only needed a warm body, ready and willing to learn basic skills. That's right, Amazon warehouse coming to a place near you. When I saw the position, I applied pretty much right away. There wasn't even an interview process at all, actually. Just show up, do your drug test, fill out the forms, take a photo for a potential worker ID, and then go home and wait for your day to show up at work. I was honestly kind of taken aback at how easy and simple the whole process was. Got the job that very same week, and before I knew it, I was off to work at this new place. I was extremely nervous at first, so I kind of overcompensated for this being my first job. I made sure to show up on the dot for every single shift, not even a single minute early or late. I would literally stand by the punch-in waiting for the clock to shift from 5:59 to 6 p.m., or whatever time the shift start was. Sure, you could technically cover the extra time with your PTO if you were late, but hey, I didn't want to be seen as lazy at my first job. Because of my overzealousness, I kinda burned myself out real quick like. Started to use the PTO I'd saved up from working so hard to cover entire shifts, because I just didn't feel like showing up that day. Still though, I made absolutely sure to never receive any infarctions or write-ups or anything like that. I always worked real hard when I did show up too. At a point about 3 months into this line of work, the main road I would take to get to work started to undergo an absolute ton of construction work. It was never really consistent either. No signs saying this road will be closed from so-and-so time to so-and-so time. Instead, you just happen to be driving along when bam, suddenly there were a bunch of bulldozers and equipment blocking 2 lanes of the 4-lane street. This started to often put me in danger of being late when I had no PTO left to cover for that late time. I started to leave earlier to combat this, but sometimes even leaving up to an entire hour early was just barely enough time to make it in. Other times, I'd leave and get there with 30 minutes to spare. I started to look for alternative routes to work. This main road I took was a huge busy road with multiple entrances and exits to a big freeway. It also had several branching side streets where doctors' offices, businesses, and apartment complexes reside. I mean, surely with all of these branching roads, there had to be some more efficient way to arrive on time, right? Eventually, after about a week of searching, I did indeed find a good road that seemed to never have any traffic and would get me there on time every time. I found it just off a little offshoot road of an apartment complex in one of the more rural areas, a part of the suburbs where rural roads slowly morphed into city life. This particular road was a long stretch of about 15 miles or so with no streetlights, going through an area that seemed to be full of open rock quarries. It was this huge open space, and it was honestly quite breathtaking to look at while driving through as well. At the end of this road was a right turn that would put me on a road that led directly to the neighborhood just before my turn in to work. I started using this road to commute to work whenever I could see roadwork, construction, heavy traffic, etc. on the horizon. I got pretty used to the scenery. And over time, I began to suspect that these quarries were currently defunct, or at least not currently in operating season. There were never any cars or workers around when I drive down it. I never saw any lights or hints of the big towers overlooking them doing anything either. In fact, a lot of the machinery was in a state where it either looked like it was just starting to rust, or it had been put on a long break for a long time. I never really thought about this too much though. I just drove that long road to work, mostly always in the daytime. On this one particular night though, I remember I hadn't managed to grab a day shift for a long while. Getting shifts at Amazon can be super competitive for part-timers since it's a first-come, first-served basis on A to Z grabbing them. They all pop up at the same time every day for everyone, except for a select few. Unfortunately, my luck ran out. Driving down to work, I saw the familiar sight of a bunch of cones and signs indicating that construction was ongoing, and I'd need to take a detour. Well, crap. I guess it's time to hit that long quarry road again for the first time in a while. Now, I should note here that I'd never actually been down this road at night before. As I made the move to turn onto it, it was mostly already dark out. I looked down at that huge empty space of complete darkness laid out in front of me as far as the eye could see. I honestly began to feel the first inklings of a chill creeping on. It looked extremely creepy, sure, but I'd never actually seen anybody on this road before, so surely there should be nothing to worry about. I had now driven the first 3 miles or so with nothing but my headlights lighting up the area in front of my car now. I remember distinctly, I kept having those intrusive thoughts where you imagine yourself not seeing a divot in the road or something because it's so dark. You end up veering into the machinery and dying a horrible death or whatever. I was startled out of these daydreams when I thought I began to see something coming up on the road about a mile ahead or so. I couldn't exactly tell what it was at first, but as I started to get a bit closer, I could see what appeared to be a car directly in the middle of the road. It appeared to be parked diagonally through the street, with yellow cones laid out on either side of it, blocking access from going any further. As I approached and started to slow down to stop, this was only a 2-lane road, mind you. I was extremely confused at seeing such an out-of-place object here. I noticed the car was a truck of some sort, not too dissimilar to what you might see from actual construction workers parked on the side of the road next to a site. At this point, I was forced to completely come to a stop at this blockade, but now I was even more confused. I couldn't see any construction equipment or even any materials anywhere. I also didn't see any workers around. How could construction be going on with such low lighting anyway? I started to get real scared at this point. I decided to throw my car in reverse, do a 3-point turn on this narrow road, and go back the way I had come from. I looked back into my rearview mirror at this point, just to make sure the road was clear out of instinct. I laughed at myself for doing this. There were still no cars coming down this road. I mean, why would there be? As my headlights whipped around the turn, I could no longer see the roadblock because of the darkness. What I could see now, though, some few hundred feet away in the distance, barely illuminated in the headlights, was what appeared to be a second car, a black sedan, now blocking the direction I had just come from, and parked directly front to back, blocking off the entire road. Fight or flight activated immediately. I could feel my heart begin beating out of my chest, and hear it beating in my ears as well. I'd seen these things in horror movies, but this couldn't possibly be real, right? In my moment of panic, I tried to turn around again, now halfway between these two blockages of the road. My headlights whipped around once more, only this time, they seemed to bounce off of something as I turned around. I stopped mid-turn in surprise, only to see what appeared to be a construction worker walking out of the area near the entrance to the quarry, an area which had been hidden behind a small hill. I'd missed this at first because I'd been pointed straight ahead, but now that I was at a light angle, I could see the man appeared to have been hiding there the entire time. He swiftly began to walk toward my car with purpose. I was already skeeved out. All of this had happened within the span of just under half a minute. I was starting to get overwhelmed. Something was clearly wrong here. This man wasn't wearing a proper orange reflective vest either, but what appeared to be some kind of mesh with reflective tape placed on it haphazardly. It was just slightly off from the real thing, but something that could have easily fooled someone on a dark road from far away. I started driving forward at this point, deciding, fuck it, I'm just gonna go through those cones. There's gotta be enough room. My car started to speed up, and out of the corner of my eye, I could see the man talking into something, perhaps a phone or walkie-talkie. I couldn't really tell in the dark.
Hey, you! Stop right there! There's construction! You gotta stop!
I floored it. I could make out the car in my rear view now reorienting itself with its headlights on, turning to face the same direction I was now going. Talk about a damn horror movie. I swerved around the truck in the center of the road in front of me, nearly plowing my car into one of the little divots on the side of the road like a dumbass and sending those cones flying out of the way. The man on foot started to sprint to his truck now too. It seemed the chase was on. We sped down the rest of that unlit road at nearly 65 miles per hour, as both cars now followed behind me, now flashing their high beams and honking like crazy. Honestly, it was so bright because of the area that it was kind of blinding me from the reflection in my mirrors. I had to turn them away from me, just so I could continue to drive. At one point, since it was a straight line shot, one of the cars pulled into the oncoming traffic lane and tried to pull up alongside me. I could only guess they were going to try to ram me into the ditch or something before I could make it to the end of the road and have an out. As it turns out though, 10 miles or so is not really that far to go when you're driving at high speeds and in a straight line with no traffic at all. I mean, sure, it feels like an eternity while you're in the moment, even more when you're being chased by psychos for almost 7 whole minutes. But before I knew it, we had reached the intersection at the end of the road, turning back into the populated neighborhood areas. As I continued to speed towards this crossroads, I saw both cars behind me now begin to slow down considerably and turn off their headlights before ceasing following me altogether. In my panic, I kinda forgot about work and that right turn I needed to take. I mean, who the fuck cares about work in the moment when something like that happens to you anyway? Instead, I turned left, back toward the way I'd need to get home. I just needed to be anywhere but here right now. For the rest of the drive back, I sat in silence, thinking about what had just happened to me. I don't know why, but it occurred to me in that moment that I might get written up, since I didn't have enough PTO to cover this missed shift. I also thought about what I was going to tell my mom when I got home. I was so worried about getting into trouble for some reason. When I hurriedly pulled into my garage and sat there sobbing for 5 minutes though, my mom came out to hear my story, and she was not particularly angry with me for whatever reason. She did encourage me to call the police though, because that was some seriously shady shit going down. I did, but of course by the time they made it out there, the perpetrators were long gone from the area. I never did manage to find out what it was all about. I imagine they wanted to rob some unsuspecting passerby thinking it would be a good detour and capitalize on the construction going on nearby. The only thing I can't really figure out is why the guy was hiding behind that little hill like that. If he'd been there at the truck itself, he could have probably easily caught me off guard. I don't know, maybe they didn't want people being turned off from so far away because of the reflective vest or something. I'm no expert on roadside banditry. Oh, and yes, if you're wondering, I did get written up in the end, even after explaining what happened to my supervisor. I mean, I know policy is policy and all, but still, that's kind of messed up, isn't it? So this story is kind of long. I'm going to try to condense it as much as I can so it doesn't drag on. In the fall of 2019, I was going through a really rough patch. I was extremely depressed and in a very dark place at the time. When my friend invited me to go to the Davy Crockett National Forest with him to camp, I was more than happy to oblige him. We decided we would camp at the Ratcliffe Lake campgrounds for 2 nights. Then the third, we would stay at a free camping spot, somewhere off the miles of park roads scattered throughout the forest. The first couple of nights went by amazingly. I loved the smell of pines, especially in East Texas, and the campsite was beautiful, not to mention the lake. We did some kayaking and hiking, and the views really helped out my mindset. It was actually really awesome. On the third morning, however, my friend suddenly got an emergency call and had to bail out at the last second. I was slightly upset, but it didn't necessarily mean I had to go home just because he did. I decided to still stick to the original plan and find a place to camp deep within that forest. After he left, I headed to the nearest forest information center and snagged myself a map. The map showed the nearby highways and forest. I scouted a couple of park roads and made my way towards them. After maybe 5 miles out of town, I finally found a park road, which was indicated by a numbered sign. This was only a dirt road. I headed down it and settled in for adventure. The road was not very narrow, but it would have been a hassle to move 2 trucks around each other, which I didn't really encounter. I kept the map on my lap and followed that road with my fingers, while I also checked the road ahead for potholes. The woods got super dense around me, and darker as well. It all kind of just enveloped my truck. I don't know how many miles I traveled before I first came to another turnoff, but it was clear I was super deep in these woods. I had traveled to where one group of campsites was supposed to be, which was a small loop. I turned around, and to my surprise was met with a couple of trucks and RVs, all occupants outside cleaning guns or dressing deer. Please don't come at me, I've never been hunting. It was hunting season, so I guess it wasn't that big of a surprise, but it was still very off-putting with the dirty looks I was receiving. I made the loop and carried on instead of stopping there. I continued to drive a few more miles and found another very remote spot at the very corner of these woods. I pulled over and set up the tent and a fire and brought out the whiskey. I did not have a very great night and was burning some letters as well. I got a little bit more messed up than I would have cared to be. I ate some food, put out the fire, and headed into the tent to play my Switch and wind down. It didn't take me too long to fall asleep, and I slept real hard. I woke up suddenly, though, at maybe 1 a.m., to the sound of footsteps encircling my campsite. I'm a pretty avid camper, so at first I assumed it was a critter checking out the human who decided to chill in its pad without asking. I started to drift off again when I heard a low cough. Instantly, I shot awake. I just kinda laid there, listening. The footsteps approached my truck. I had locked it, thankfully, but I heard the obvious signs of someone trying the handle. They then shuffled over to the other side and tried the other one as well. I had a spotlight I had brought with me, so I quietly unzipped the tent and pointed my light in the direction of the noise. I shouted out. I caught a very brief glimpse of whoever it was, dressed all in camo. They sprinted off into the woods with no light. They took off. Although I had no plans of following them, I scanned the brush with my light and couldn't see a single thing. I turned off my light to see if I could see a phone light or a flashlight maybe, but instead I heard very loud crashing into the brush that got quieter and further away. Whoever this person was running into those dark woods with no lights and all camo on. Considering the map, The direction he ran did not have any more roads or amenities, so maybe this was private property. I don't know, but I was very scared. I collapsed my tent, shoved it in the fucking bag, shoved that in my back seat, and drove the park roads like a bat out of hell. Once I got back to the main road, I drove 4 hours back to my hometown. I do want to go back sometime, but with friends and maybe a gun. Yeah, that was not a fun experience, and definitely up there as one of the most frightening things that's ever happened to me in the woods. On second thought, actually, I think the dude might have had night vision goggles just for this sort of occasion. This happened in 2013, when I was living in the city with 2 roommates. We're all women, by the way. I was going to school at the time. I wrote down everything immediately after it happened, intending to 1. Have a record of any details, should it become important later since the police didn't want to file a report for this, and 2. To share it someday. I never did end up sharing it, at least until now. This isn't a horror story, maybe so much as a story about stumbling onto the aftermath of someone else's, but I was pretty spooked at the time. With minor edits for context and clarity, here is that account of events from all that time ago. I live in a pretty old house, at least 100 years old. This is pretty typical of the area, but the inside appears to have been gutted and remodeled at some point during its history. Mostly what that translates to is a bunch of weirdly sized closets, but it also meant there was no pre-designed space for the water heater to go. Putting it in the house would have sacrificed space in one of the closets, so they installed it and the heating system under the house in this crude dirt-floored crawl space. This became relevant last month when a city utility worker needed to get to my hot water heater. The sole entrance to this crawl space was out back, under the little deck we share with the neighboring unit. It's a little wooden door padlocked shut. It had been padlocked ever since I moved in there. In fact, I don't even think I knew it was there for the first couple of months. I called the rental company and they sent a guy over who unlocked it, but he did not look inside. When the utility worker arrived sometime later, it was already getting dark. I went down with her just in case she needed me to hand her anything. I felt kind of bad she was out after standard working hours and about to crawl into this cramped, dirty, and undoubtedly full of spiders space under my house. She opened the little door, shined her flashlight inside, and said, "Well, that's kind of creepy." Since she just told me she was used to crawl spaces and not scared of them, I started to get pretty uneasy. I fervently hoped we had not just discovered a body or something. Not gonna lie, I've been low-key expecting to stumble on a corpse since I was like 5. With that in mind, what we did find was actually a little bit underwhelming. Inside the cramped space under the house, lit by the tech's flashlight, was an improvised camping setup, a sleeping bag on a stack of filthy foam, camping mattresses, a suitcase spilling clothes out onto the dirt, and a clothesline hung with yet even more clothes. There was food and drink wrappers, stacks and stacks of newspapers. She was surprisingly chill about it, actually. I wanted her to get out immediately, so we could call the police. I didn't think the person was there right now, but I worried the improvised camp under my house might constitute some kind of crime scene. I was pretty confident it must be real old. We'd had a home invasion just a couple months ago, you see, so we'd all been really vigilant. I figured that since we kept irregular schedules and parked out back, we'd have seen a squatter coming and going. There was also no smell. Due to a couple of stupid decisions earlier in my youth, I'd discovered people squatting in abandoned buildings before. They'd always had this odor of stale urine. She insisted, though, that since we had the door open already, she'd go in and get that heater working once again. I probably should have insisted, but she honestly didn't seem that disturbed. I figured she knew better what she was doing. She found a little pull chain connected to a bare bulb and pulled it, which lit the whole place in weak yellow light, showing her the way to the appliance. It wasn't enough to light the entire crawl space, but it was just enough that I could see that whoever had lived there had even made furniture out of a bunch of milk crates. She fixed what she'd come to fix and sat with me until the cops came. I kind of expected them to tell me that what I was seeing had to be something else, but actually they refused to even look in the crawl space. I guess because it was starting to rain. They seemed to just take my account at face value. It just so happened that they didn't really want to do anything about it, and told me it was really my landlord's problem. It wasn't really the expected response, but whatever, I guess. It ends very anticlimactically. I called the retail agency and told them about this as well. They sent a crew out to throw out all the stuff and re-secure the crawl space. I was not able to be there when they did it, but I asked them to find the most recent newspaper and give me the date. I wanted to get some kind of timeline for when this person had been underneath the house. It was June of 2011, 2 years before we moved in. I was able to find out from the rental guy, though, that the house was occupied at that time. So I guess this is really the people before us' horror story. Hey guys, just wanted to let you know this does contain some NSFW content. Anywho, this is a story that happened throughout 2015. Also, to clarify, I am a girl. Basically, it started off with my friend telling me to get a grip and go have some fun. They dragged me out to a gathering that was hosted by my university. Anyway, during this time, I just mostly chatted, ate, and looked at my phone. You know, the usual. At some point, though, I noticed this guy staring at me from afar. He was a pretty tall man. For reference, I'm about 5'2". He looked to be in his mid-20s, and honestly, he wasn't that bad looking. After a while, he came over and introduced himself as Alex. Alex was pretty nice. We spoke about our hobbies, and I told him I practiced MMA and sparred in my spare time. I also probably spent way too much time gaming. He told me about his own small business that he wanted to start. He was very friendly and at the time didn't give off any indication he was a creep at all. After this event, we exchanged mobile numbers. In hindsight, this was a terrible move on my part. We parted ways soon after. As I was on the train home, I received a new Facebook ad. I checked my phone only to see it was Alex. I shrugged and didn't think too much of it. I accepted. I mean, I don't exactly have a very common name, so it really wouldn't be hard to find me on Facebook if you already knew it and typed it in. As soon as I accepted, we started chatting again. It was pretty normal and casual. I won't bore you with all the details because of this. Soon after, we both called it a night when I arrived home. The next few days, I chatted with him intermittently, while I kept up with my studies and hobbies. He was always friendly with me and seemed very interesting. This lasted about a week. After that initial week, my image of Alex completely changed. He began to add a lot of innuendos to the conversation. I brushed it off at first because I thought this was him feeling more comfortable with me. Then he began to send me messages describing my body, saying how he wanted to have sex with me since he first saw me, how he wanted me so much. I declined and told him I had a boyfriend, but I would be cool with just being friends with him instead. Alex, of course, did not give up. He began to send me photos of himself naked, as well as a lot of porn. He also sent a lot of questions asking if he could do what was depicted in the porn to me, as well as film him having sex with me. I blocked him then and there on my phone, as well as on Facebook. I told all my friends, but they just sort of laughed it off. They were basically telling me how I'm always too friendly until it's too late, hence why I keep getting myself into these situations. Things were pretty calm for about 2 weeks, until one morning I received a notification from Facebook letting me know I had a new message request. Of course, this was Alex from a different account. This time, though, it was not porn or an innuendo or a sexy question. It was my full address. To clarify, Alex and I did not share any mutuals. There should have been no way for him to find out my address, because none of my friends at university know me well enough to know it. Needless to say, I was pretty freaked out. I told my boyfriend, who was furious with Alex. He notified my friend's mother, who happened to be a police officer. She lived close by, so she promised to keep an eye out. During this time, Alex kept messaging me with different numbers and accounts, most of them containing my address, and him telling me how much I turned him on and how he was going to get me one day. In a fit of stupidity and anger, I messaged him back, telling him to stay the fuck away. I would not hesitate to kick his ass if he ever laid a hand on me. He simply replied with a smiley face, and I didn't hear from him until 3 months later. Fast forward those 3 months. I had practically forgotten about Alex until one night in bed with my phone when it vibrated. It was a text from an unknown number asking how I was. I replied not even knowing who it was, and shortly after I received a text back.
"It's Alex. Don't you remember me?"
I didn't reply, and it got even creepier. 5 minutes later, my phone vibrated again.
"I'm outside your house. Which room is yours?"
I'm surprisingly not freaking out, even as he described my house in full detail. I called my boyfriend, who said he would be right over. He lived about 10 minutes away. I grabbed a sword off my rack and hung onto it in case I would need it. I was also trying to get in contact with my friend's mother, but it was practically 2 a.m. at this point, and I was just not getting through. This whole time I was still getting texts from him, the most vivid ones saying,
"I know you have a boyfriend, but it isn't cheating if you lie under me naked and let me come all over your body. I just want a cute girl to be rough with."
He then told me how much he wanted to come in my eyeballs and choke me. I probably shouldn't have even replied, but being the hot-headed idiot I am, I said, "Fuck off, I have a sword."
"I've got a knife, you know."
That didn't sit too well with me. I texted him back saying I'd called the police and given them his number as well. I told them my boyfriend was coming right over too. A very short while later, I heard a car start and drive away, and my phone vibrated one more time.
"Well, if you ever want to have sex, you know where I am."
The day after I alerted campus security, my friend's mother filed an official report for me, and I gave them all his details. I haven't heard from him since, and I pray 2016 is completely Alex-free. I live in a pretty small city, but we have a pretty impressive mall called Destiny USA. It's absolutely huge, like 7 stories in some parts. In fact, it's the 6th largest mall in the US, or something like that. You're probably wondering why I'm rambling on about this at the beginning, but it does play a part in the story. Like normal teenagers, me and my best friend at the time went there quite often. One Saturday, my dad dropped us off at around 3:30, and we began walking around together. About 2 hours after we got there, these 2 guys make really loud and unnecessary gross comments to each other about us. As we walked by them, they made sure we heard too, and were staring us down. We were only 14 years old at the time, but we'd already gotten catcalled quite a few times despite our age. Disgusting, I know. We didn't really think anything of it at first because of this though. Not even 2 minutes later though, I looked back for whatever reason, when I realized these 2 guys from before are now walking behind us. I was feeling a little bit uneasy now, but not too worried. I told my friend anyways though, and we decided to keep going and take unexpected turns into stores to make sure they weren't actually following us. We went into various stores on that floor. Whenever we would come out, they were always lingering nearby on a bench, not actually sitting down. They would begin walking again as soon as we exited the store. At this point, we started panicking. Neither of us were large or intimidating girls. I was only 5'2", and she stood at a mere 4'9". Neither of us weighed any more than 105 pounds. We sped walked to the nearest elevator, trying not to let them know we'd caught on to them following us. We pushed random buttons and ended up getting off on the floor underneath the one we were previously on. We walked around for a while, until we saw those very same guys coming from the opposite direction now straight towards us. My friend alerted me, and we went back the way we came from. We took the escalator up to another floor, then ran over to a section of the mall that was just recently built. After a good distance into this new section, we started peeking over the railing onto the floor below us. It didn't take very long for those 2 fuckers to show up there, frantically looking around and obviously searching for us. As I mentioned though, our mall is huge. It was super unlikely to ever see the same person twice, let alone multiple times in a matter of minutes. I started planning in my head what we were going to do. I soon realized that since they were directly underneath us, even if we decided to take off, there was a balcony sort of thing on all floors that allowed you to look down onto the ones below. This meant they could see us pretty much anywhere we decided to go if we were on a lower floor. We tried sneaking into a nearby store and out of view of them, all while praying they would not look up to the floor above them. Just then, though, we could hear a loud, "There they are! Come on, let's go!" We looked back, and one of the men was pointing at us. They were now both looking at us with this furious expression. They started booking it to one of the escalators that led to the floor we were currently on. Me and my friend were in full panic mode now. She was hyperventilating, and I felt like I was going to throw up. We started hauling ass trying to get away from them. We continued running, starting to slow down from exhaustion. Now, the two dudes were off the escalator and were almost directly adjacent to us. My friend told me to text my dad and tell him we were ready to leave, to get his car from the parking lot and bring it to the front entrance to pick us up. Luckily, my dad usually drops us off, then does his own shopping while we're walking around. Therefore, if anything happened, he was not too far away, and we could meet up with him easily. We were tearing ass through this huge building, scared as fuck, trying to text my dad while these two dudes were running after us. They were gaining speed and getting closer by the minute. Luckily, when we got to the entrance of the mall, we saw my dad. The two guys that were following us reluctantly backed off. I'm very thankful my dad was still there, since the security guards at that mall are basically useless. No bystanders even asked us what we were running from. It may not seem that scary, but it was terrifying, given we were only 14 years old. It's been about a year since this happened, but this and a few other scary encounters caused me to buy a taser, mace, and a hunting knife. I still don't know how they were able to find us so fast, given how big that mall is. Years ago, I was home from university and was spending the evening with my girlfriend. We were both feeling a little bit frisky, but since we were home from college at our parents' houses, we decided to go for a little drive. Our hometown was fairly rural, so it didn't take much time for us to drive out somewhere on a country road near an alfalfa field where we could have some privacy. Hardly anyone would drive past here, maybe one truck every other hour or so. The engine is off, the lights are off, our seats are reclined. My car was small, so there wasn't any room to get in the back and really go at it, but tenderness is tenderness whether there's a stick shift between you or not. That night, though, I'm real glad I had to stay in the driver's seat. Just as things were beginning to get real heated, I see some headlights in the rear view mirror coming up the road. That's not a big deal, so I toned down the action a bit, waiting for it to pass us by. As the trucks get closer, though, its headlights suddenly go dark. My girlfriend wasn't totally aware of this yet, but I pulled away a bit out of curiosity. Then I heard the coasting, gravelly crunch of a vehicle pulling off onto the gravel just behind us. It was completely dark there, no street lights or anything to go by. With what moon there was, though, I could barely make out the outline of a truck behind us. No cab lights, no running engine. I quickly asked my girlfriend if her door was locked. This stopped her dead in her tracks. She said it was and asked what was wrong. I told her there was now someone behind us, parked in the dark in the gravel. She immediately straightened herself up, and I put my seat back up as well, never taking my eyes off the mirror. I saw the driver's side door to the truck open. The cab lights still didn't turn on, and I never saw anyone get out, but that was my sign to leave immediately. I told my girlfriend we needed to leave right now, to which she quietly replied an okay. I started up the vehicle, trying my very best to not spin out in the gravel. I drove as fast as I could onto the road. We drove in silence for about 2 minutes, heading back towards town, when I noticed I could not see the sky clearly behind our vehicle. We were being followed. The truck still did not turn on its headlights, but it was tailgating me very closely now in the dark. I calmly informed my girlfriend that they were behind us now. We still had plenty of gas though, and we'd get back to town just fine. No big deal. She said okay in that little voice again, and went silent, glancing back every so often. This continued for about 2 minutes. I briefly considered calling the police before the headlights behind me flared on. The truck revved its engine and pulled into the other lane. We were still on a 2-lane asphalt country road. It just hauled past me like a bat out of hell. I felt like I should take her home at this point, but the last thing I wanted was for this asshole to follow us to where she lived. Whatever their mission and whoever they were, they had succeeded in making us feel uneasy. I told her as much and she agreed. We wove a flighty path through several nice neighborhoods before pulling into a cul-de-sac where we could sit and wait to see if it was still around. We never saw the truck again that night, but our cul-de-sac time did give us the opportunity to have the intimate time we had been wanting, all the more intense due to constantly watching to make sure we'd be safe. Looking back, I'm sure it was just some country farm people annoyed at catching even more kids making out near their fields. They probably just wanted to bang on our windows and give us a good scare for fun. But if that's the case, I have to wonder why they followed us for so long and why they passed us the way they did. Were they out for a joyride looking for some entertainment? Who knows? Although I make a personal appearance in this story, this encounter actually happened to my brother. I'll recount it the way he told me it went down. My brother Nova was excitedly going to a midnight premiere with his friend Sam. Both of the guys were quite young and eager, basically the most pumped two teen boys can be. It was a movie showing at midnight for Man of Steel. They had arranged for Nova's darling older sister, me, to pick them up during her lunch. Graveyard life at the time, once that movie was over. The evening started out pretty harmless. There were tons of people around, a couple of familiar faces they waved down as well. This was a small town after all. Out of nowhere though, this older guy, think late 20s, to younger teens that's older, and girl closer to their age approached them. They were sort of dressed like everyone in middle school used to dress, Hot Topic drapery and the like. Still though, they were seemingly friendly, and due to the high energy level nerd gatherings create, Nova and Sam weren't in the least bit alarmed. Quickly, the man did start to act a bit odd though, with questions that might not necessarily be deemed as creepy, if asked in another way.
So, you two young boys are here by yourselves, eh? Guys like you don't have girlfriends to come with you?
Nova and Sam exchanged looks and decided to lie. They said that yes, they did have girlfriends, they just weren't here right at the moment. They even got a mutual friend to pretend to be one of their girls, but unfortunately she had to sneak off to be with her actual boyfriend. The man then tried to fix the question by adding something else.
Oh, that's a shame. See, my sister here thinks you guys are really cute. And so do I.
The man then laughed in a really flirty way. Nova and Sam were quite shocked. This guy had just heard they were straight, but it straight up felt predatory since he was significantly older than them. He asked even more questions, delighted to find out they were still in high school. Nova was trying really hard to disclose nothing, but Sam was a bit more naive. He told one too many details. Fortunately, they were saved right in that moment. The scramble for good seats began, and they ran for one of the theaters. Nova and Sam were relieved when they did find seats, and quickly joked off what had happened. By the time the previews had started, they had calmed down and decided the creepy man and his sister were just messing with them for their own enjoyment. To their dismay though, the man and sister came in and specifically searched them out, then sat right down next to Nova. The man made a casual joke about how the boys had run, and he was so glad to be able to find them again. At this point, the boys were unsure what to do. Nova had never had something like this happen, and he really wanted to see this movie. The movie started, and the man began to whisper sexual comments to them. Nova gave the man a pursed lip expression, and leaned toward the movie to ignore him even further. He then decided to tap Nova on the leg, and said he wanted to show them both something. Trying not to disturb everyone else and stop this insistent man, the boys looked over. The man had pulled up on his phone a very graphic gay pornography video. The man started laughing hysterically, and the sister also smiled intensely as well. The two boys didn't know what to do. They couldn't run, I was their only ride, and they'd paid good money for this damn premiere. Good money for kids at least. Nova told the man to stop with his shit. There were kids here and this was complete harassment. Eventually, the movie finished and the boys bolted it out of there. I was just sitting in the parking lot right in front of the doors. They jumped in my car all out of breath and shouted at me to leave. We gunned it out of the parking lot and the boys looked all around them. They refused to tell me what had happened until I had them back home. Words can't describe how furious I was. I wanted to turn around and fold those people up in 5 ways, then leave them as a cat toy. In the end, nothing else came of it though. My brother Nova did say the bizarre experience was in a way really educational. He couldn't imagine being a girl and feeling that type of sexual harassment all the time. Both the boys decided from then on out they would always take dates with them to midnight movie showings from then on. Let me preface this by saying that when this happened, I realized I was an idiot. The biggest, most naive idiot in the entire world. I thought that because I had lived in so many countries and seen so many cultures, I was smarter than I was and more grown up than my peers. But God, was I wrong. I should have seen the red flags and booked it out of there. When this story takes place, I was 14 years old and attending a boarding school in Connecticut. I'm female, by the way. My family was in Switzerland, so I could only really see them on school holidays. I was currently going through my emo phase, moody and pissed at the mainstream, and hating how preppy my school was. I made friends with the most non-mainstream kids I could find there. At 22, I'd still cringe at these past memories. One of my friends was dating this townie who wanted to be a tattoo artist. Boy, did I want a tattoo, and I just could not wait to turn 18. He agreed to tattoo me as he was just learning and didn't have his license yet. What harm could possibly happen? Side note, I now have a terrible tattoo. But I digress. We talked and agreed that I'd take the bus to Waterbury and meet him on the green, where all the buses meet and transfer. I had no idea of the layout of the area, as I stayed in the campus bubble mostly. If you don't know, Waterbury Court has its nice parts, but where I was gross. Shootings happen regularly. Crackheads were abundant. It was not a good part of town. Back then, I didn't care though. I thought I would be just fine. It's Saturday, and I just finished up classes. And yes, we did have Saturday classes. I was all excited about getting this new tattoo and being edgy. I jumped on the bus and texted my friend's boyfriend I was on the way. Fast forward now. I'm at the green waiting for him to get out of his classes. He texts me to say he'll be an hour late. Great. What the hell am I supposed to do in this shitty part of town all alone? 2 hours passed by, and he finally said he'd be done in just one more. I really wanted this tattoo, so I waited. I had been sitting there for probably 2.5 hours when I noticed this big black SUV pull up and park in the bus drop-off zone. This big guy came out. The windows were tinted, so I didn't know if he was alone. He sat down right next to me. There were loads of empty benches around, but of course he chose the one I was on. Red flag immediately. I was dressed in a band shirt, black skinny jeans with Converse, weird colors in my hair, the usual emo regalia. Nothing was revealing, but I did stick out like a sore thumb. I thought he just wanted to talk to me because I looked different. Again, I was a total idiot. He started right off with asking what I was doing there, where I'm from, how old I am. I thought I could take on the world, so I boldly told him I was 14, but way more mature than people my age. Then things started to get bad. His eyes lit up immediately when I said my age. He asked if I was a virgin, and if I'd ever given anyone a blowjob. Immediately I panicked. I started stuttering and my face got bright red. He laughed and put his hand on my thigh and squeezed. He said I could jump into his car, and he'd treat me just right. Bring me back in a few hours or so. I didn't know what to do or say. I was now looking around for an adult, but there was a lull and no buses were there. The man pulled me in closer to him, and now I was terrified.
Baby girl, it'll only be a few hours. Let me show you how a real man does it. Ever had a black dick before? Once you go black, you never go back.
He laughed deeply after this and stared right into my eyes. I lost it at this point. I was nauseous and about to cry. He saw me crying and smiled even more, wiping a tear and clearly enjoying how uncomfortable I was. He got up and started tugging my arm to get me to go with him and steered me toward his car. I tried my best to resist, but it was a 5'8", 140-pound girl against a 6'2", 250-pound man. He started to get aggressive when I resisted, and had me really close to his car now. Suddenly, I heard someone yell out, "Hey, get away from her!" The black man let me go and booked it to his car. He peeled off like he was being chased by the police. He probably thought it really was the police, to be honest. I looked at who had saved me. It was a bus driver who had been waiting for his shift to start and watching us from the nearby Dunkin's. I fell to the ground and started sobbing. I've never been approached by anyone like this. Never been so close to God knows what awful thing this man could have done to me. I was so helpless in that moment. The bus driver called the police and reported the incident, giving a partial plate and description as well. I tried my best to give a description of the guy, but I was in such shock I don't think it was very useful. I didn't hear anything about it later, so I assume they never found him. In the end, I took another bus back to school and didn't tell anyone I was nearly abducted, or worse. I couldn't stand to have them think I was weak or couldn't take care of myself. I was so embarrassed by what I had gotten myself into. I actually didn't tell anyone until just a year ago. I'm back in that part of the world now, and told one of my high school friends when we drove past that exact spot. She was shocked. I realize now just how indebted I am to that bus driver. He literally saved me from being at least abducted. Who knows what that man had in store for me if he got me into the SUV. I ended up meeting with my friend's boyfriend the weekend after, and made up some bullshit excuse for not even meeting me at the agreed upon time, giving a fake apology as well. I was so pissed at him that after the terrible tattoo he gave me, I never even talked to him again.